People tell you everything without words. Someone answers your question with the right sentence, the polite sentence, the sentence you were hoping to hear, and still something in your chest does not settle. A small static that has nothing to do with the words and everything to do with the half-second before them. The tightening around the eyes, the tiny delay, the shift of weight from one foot to the other. That static is data. Psychologists have spent decades measuring how much of any exchange actually travels through language, and the number that keeps surfacing is startling. Somewhere between 60 and 90% of what a person communicates arrives through channels that have nothing to do with vocabulary, the posture, the timing, the breath, the distance they keep, all of it running underneath the sentence like a second conversation the mouth was never invited to. Words are the part of a person that has been edited for your comfort and their safety, rehearsed, softened, chosen with half an eye on how they will land, while the body is still improvising, unable to fully rehearse 100 small muscles at once, and so it leaks the version that was never approved for release. This is why a lie can be technically perfect and still feel wrong, why a compliment can use exactly the right words and still land flat, why you can walk away from a warm conversation carrying a cold feeling you cannot explain, because you were never only listening to the sentence, you were reading the whole transmission. And some part of you always has been. This is not a call to distrust everyone around you, only a reminder that the verbal channel was never meant to carry the whole message alone, and treating it as though it did leaves you working from a partial transcript. Notice, this week, the gap between what someone says and what your body registers while they are saying it. And instead of arguing yourself out of the feeling because the words checked out, let the gap itself be information, since it usually is. The smile that does not reach the eyes. A smile crosses a room toward you, mouth curving on schedule, teeth appearing right where a smile's teeth appear. And yet, something about it reads as closer to a formality than a feeling, the way a signature can be technically correct and still look nothing like enthusiasm. There is a name for the difference. The genuine smile, the one researchers call the Duchenne smile, after the anatomist who first mapped it, recruits a small ring of muscle around the eyes, the orbicularis oculi, producing the crinkling at the corners that most people cannot fake convincingly, no matter how hard they try. Because that particular muscle answers to real feeling far more reliably than it answers to conscious instruction. The social smile skips this part almost entirely, using only the muscles that are easy to command on purpose, which is exactly why it looks like what it is, a decision rather than a response, warmth performed rather than warmth arriving. The gap between the two is not subtle once you know where to look, though most people never learn to look there directly, relying instead on a vague, unnamed sense that a particular smile felt slightly off, a sense that was actually your visual system correctly clocking the absence of movement around the eyes and failing to translate the finding into language. The cost of not noticing is small but real, a habit of taking performed warmth at face value and adjusting your trust accordingly, when the face itself was quietly telling you otherwise the entire time. This does not make the social smile a lie exactly, since plenty of situations call for a polite performance rather than a genuine one. A cashier and a customer, two acquaintances passing on a stairwell, the smile functioning as social lubrication rather than deception. The trouble arrives only when a performed smile gets mistaken for a felt one in a relationship where it actually matters. Notice the next smile that reaches you, and let your attention travel past the mouth to the eyes before you decide what the smile actually meant. The pause before they answer you. You ask something ordinary, nothing loaded, nothing that should require thought, and the answer arrives a beat late, just long enough to register, just short enough that naming it out loud would sound paranoid. That beat is rarely nothing. A comfortable, unguarded answer tends to arrive close to instantly, the way water moves when nothing is blocking the channel, while a delayed answer has passed through something first, a filter, a calculation, a quick internal audit of what version of the truth is safe to hand over. Sometimes the filter is entirely benign, a person reaching for precision rather than deception, wanting to get the wording right because the question actually matters to them. But the same delay is also the signature of an answer being edited in real time, the first true response arriving, getting rejected, and a second, more presentable one taking its place before it ever reaches your ears, the pause being the only visible evidence that the substitution occurred. What makes this hard to read cleanly is that both kinds of pause look identical from the outside, and only the accompanying signals, the eyes, the breath, the the small shift in posture, tell you which one you are actually witnessing, which is why the pause alone is a clue and never a verdict on its own. There is a particular kind of pause worth learning to recognize on its own, the one that arrives before a comfortable lie rather than a difficult truth, longer than the lie itself would seem to require, because constructing a plausible untruth on the spot takes more cognitive work than simply reporting what happened. This is part of why interrogation training spends so much time on timing, since expected content can be rehearsed, but the timing of an unexpected question is harder to fake. Notice the pauses that arrive before answers this week, and instead of dismissing the loaded ones as your imagination, let the weight you sense in them be treated as real information about how much editing just happened before the sentence reached you. How quickly they reply to you. A message sits unanswered for 6 hours, and by the time the reply finally lands, you have already built and dismantled 3 separate explanations for the silence, none of which felt as simple as the true one probably was, that you were simply not on their mind. Response time looks like a logistics question, a matter of schedules and notifications and how busy someone's day happens to be. But underneath the logistics, it is also, consistently, a signal about priority. Since a person genuinely holding you in active awareness tends to circle back to you the way attention circles back to anything it has not finished thinking about. The person for whom you occupy real space replies the way someone empties a pocket that has been bothering them, promptly, because the unanswered message was quietly present the whole time, while the person for whom you are peripheral simply does not experience that same tug. And the message waits without discomfort because nothing is pulling at them to close the loop. Any single slow reply proves very little, explained easily by a hard day or a dead phone, but the pattern across weeks and months is much harder to explain away. And the pattern is what actually carries the information, not any one instance of delay. There is an honest complication worth naming here, since some people are simply slower responders across the board, to everyone. And mistaking a general communication style for a personal verdict is its own kind of misreading. The signal worth trusting is not any single person's absolute speed, but the relative one. How quickly they reply to you compared with how quickly they reply to everyone else in their life, which strips out the general habit and leaves you looking at the part that is actually about you. Notice, without keeping score in a way that turns tender, how quickly certain people return to you compared to others, and let the pattern, gently, tell you something. The words in the eventual reply were never going to say directly. The direction their feet are pointing. In a room full of people, someone is facing you, nodding, saying all the right things, and their feet are quietly angled toward the door, or toward someone else entirely. 2 small compass needles that never got the memo about the polite performance happening above them. Feet sit at the far end of conscious management, the body part least monitored by the social mind because almost nobody thinks to police their own ankles during a conversation, which is exactly what makes them reliable. The same way handwriting under stress reveals more than a rehearsed speech does. Body language researchers and interrogators alike treat foot direction as one of the harder signals to fake deliberately, since faking it requires a level of constant, exhausting self-surveillance that most people simply do not maintain, especially across a long conversation, which is why the feet tend to drift back toward wherever the person's actual interest is pulling them the moment their attention relaxes even slightly. This does not mean every angled foot is a verdict, since posture shifts for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with you. A sore hip, an awkward chair, a draft from an open window, and reading too much into a single stance is its own kind of overinterpretation. What actually carries meaning is the pattern across a whole conversation, the feet that drift back toward you again and again, or the feet that never once return, despite a face that stays warmly engaged. Since a single glance tells you little while, a repeated tendency tells you a great deal about where genuine attention settles once left alone. Group settings make this especially visible, since in a circle of people, the feet of someone genuinely engaged with you tend to square toward you specifically, rather than toward the group. A precise orientation most people never consciously choose. Notice where feet point the next time you are talking with someone, particularly in a group, and let that quiet, unmonitored signal carry as much weight as the words being aimed politely in your direction. They mirror you when they like you. Somewhere in the middle of an easy conversation, you notice, almost by accident, that the other person has crossed their legs the same way you did a moment ago, or picked up their glass roughly when you picked up yours, A small synchrony neither of you decided on consciously, and neither of you would have noticed without looking for it. This mirroring is not imitation in any deliberate sense. It is closer to resonance. Two nervous systems quietly calibrating to each other's rhythm, the way two clocks on the same wall will eventually, mechanically, fall into step, driven by proximity and connection, rather than intention. Because the mirroring happens below the level of decision, it is difficult to counterfeit convincingly. And when people do try to consciously copy another person's posture, the result usually reads as slightly stiff, slightly delayed, missing the effortless, real-time quality that genuine rapport produces without anyone trying. The absence of mirroring is its own signal too. A conversation where two bodies never quite settle into the same rhythm, staying separate even while the words stay friendly, which tells you something the friendliness alone will not. The mirroring also tends to run in both directions at once, without either person managing it. Your own body settling into their rhythm just as readily as theirs settles into yours, which is part of why some conversations feel like a current carrying both of you along, and others feel like effort from the very first exchange. Two systems, either finding a shared frequency or never quite locating one. Watch what happens when the mirroring breaks. When a person who had been matching you suddenly stiffens, since the break is a signal, evidence that something just registered as unsafe enough to interrupt a synchrony that was running smoothly. Notice the conversations where you feel unusually at ease, and look for the quiet physical echo running underneath them. The shared rhythm that arrived before either of you agreed to share anything, since a body that mirrors you has already voted, without asking permission, that it likes being near yours. The laugh that means something else. A laugh lands in the middle of a sentence that was not particularly funny, sharp, a touch too loud, arriving on a slight delay. And something about it does not match the moment the way real amusement usually does, because it was never actually about amusement in the first place. A great deal of laughter is social rather than emotional, deployed to smooth an awkward gap, to signal agreement without committing to words, to diffuse a tension nobody wants to name directly, or simply to perform. The enjoyment a situation seems to expect, regardless of whether any enjoyment is actually present underneath it. The performed laugh tends to carry small tells that distinguish it from the real one, a timing that lands slightly off the beat of the moment, a volume mismatched to the room, an abruptness at the end, as though a switch had been flipped, rather than a feeling running its course. And these tells register in the listener as a vague sense of wrongness, long before the listener could articulate what specifically felt off. This matters because a laugh is often treated as automatic proof of comfort, when in plenty of cases it is doing exactly the opposite job, covering discomfort rather than expressing pleasure, and mistaking the cover for the content leaves you with a badly wrong read on how the moment actually landed for the other person. There is a specific version worth learning to spot, the laugh that arrives immediately after something mildly cruel or mildly true was said, doing the work of pretending the comment was harmless, softening an edge everyone felt, but nobody wants to name. That kind of laugh often has a slightly hollow quality even while it is technically loud, and the hollowness is worth trusting more than the volume, since the laugh's real job in that moment was containment rather than expression. Notice the next laugh that sounds slightly off to you, and instead of taking the sound at face value, let the mismatch you sense be trusted as more accurate than the laugh's surface. How they say your name. Your own name arrives in 100 different tones across a single week, and somewhere underneath the sameness of the word itself, you can usually feel which version was said with warmth and which was said as pure administrative necessity. The two sounding almost identical on paper and nothing alike out loud. A name is one of the few words a speaker cannot fully separate from feeling, since it is not simply a label, but a small act of direct address. A moment of pointing at a specific person rather than speaking in generalities, and the tone that accompanies it tends to carry whatever the speaker actually feels about the person being named, whether or not the speaker intends to reveal that. Someone who values you tends to say your name often, easily, sometimes with a small lift in the voice that has nothing to do with the sentence's content, while someone who is keeping distance may unconsciously avoid saying it at all, substituting generic address, hey, you, the third person. Because the name itself would require a warmth in the delivery the speaker is not prepared to supply. The avoidance is rarely a conscious strategy, which is part of what makes it reliable, a small, unplanned gap that widens the longer you pay attention to it. Listen to. For where in a sentence your name tends to land, since some people use it almost like punctuation, purely functional, while others let it drift into the middle of a sentence unnecessarily, the way you might repeat a favorite word simply because saying it feels good. Notice, too, how your name changes when a conversation turns serious, since the person who says it gently in a difficult moment, using it as an anchor rather than a formality, is doing something a person who is only mildly invested rarely bothers to do and rarely notices themselves doing. Notice how your name sounds in different mouths this week, and let the tone, not the word itself, tell you what 100 more careful sentences might never say. The distance they keep without knowing. Two people stand talking, and the space between them says something. The conversation itself is too polite to say, since physical distance in any interaction is managed almost entirely below awareness, the body making constant, tiny adjustments to how close it feels safe and desirable to stand. Adjustments that shift with trust, attraction, and comfort in ways the conscious mind rarely bothers to supervise. The inches matter more than they seem to, since the body moves closer to people it finds safe, warm, and appealing, and drifts, almost imperceptibly, away from people carrying any hint of threat, discomfort, or disinterest. A continuous, silent referendum conducted through proximity rather than words. This is why a person can say all the right things and still feel subtly withheld. The sentence is warm while the body maintains a gap that never quite closes. The two channels disagreeing in a way most listeners register only as an unnamed unease rather than a specific observation. The reverse is equally telling, someone leaning in over the course of a conversation, closing distance gradually without appearing to notice they are doing it. The body arriving at a verdict the mouth has not yet been asked to state. Cultures vary in their baseline comfort with proximity, and a wise reading accounts for that first, since a distance that signals coldness in one context might simply be the ordinary range someone grew up with, and comparing a person against their own baseline beats a universal one. What matters most is not the absolute number of inches, but the direction of the movement over time, whether a person who once kept careful distance has, across weeks or months, allowed that distance to shrink, without either of you ever discussing it, since that gradual closing is a slower, more durable kind of evidence than any single moment of proximity could provide on its own. Notice how far people stand from you, and whether that distance shrinks or holds as a conversation continues, and let the inches, quietly and consistently, cast their own vote alongside whatever is actually being said. The eye contact that says everything. A gaze can hold you for exactly as long as comfort allows and then release. Or it can hold a half second too long, or arrive too briefly, too often, too rarely. And each variation is doing communicative work that no accompanying sentence is doing, because the eyes are one of the hardest instruments in the body to fully script. Duration signals comfort or its absence. Frequency signals interest, a gaze that keeps returning to you across a room, being different in kind from one that never quite lands. And quality, the softness or hardness, the warmth or coldness behind the looking, tells you the emotional stance underneath it all. A language the eyes speak fluently, while the conscious mind, watching from a distance, only ever half translates it. Too much sustained contact reads as intensity or challenge. Too little reads as avoidance or discomfort. The comfortable range in between, which shifts somewhat by culture and by relationship, communicates something close to "I see you," and "I am at ease being seen by you," an entirely wordless sentence delivered continuously throughout an exchange. Pay attention, too, to what happens to a person's eyes in the moment right after they finish speaking, since many people manage their gaze carefully while talking, but relax it the instant the sentence ends. And that unguarded aftermath, brief as it is, often carries more honest information than the carefully maintained contact that came before it. The eyes that break away quickly after an emotionally loaded sentence are often doing something different from eyes that break away out of simple habit. The quick escape suggesting the sentence costs something to say, while a habitual, evenly distributed pattern of looking away simply reflects how that particular person's attention tends to move day to day, regardless of what is actually being discussed in that moment. Notice the quality of the gaze the next time someone looks at you for longer than a passing glance requires, and let that quality, rather than anything said afterward, register as the more complete part of the message. The energy shift when you enter. A room does not stay the same the instant you walk into it, even though almost nobody in that room would admit to changing at all. postures adjusting by fractions of an inch, attention redistributing itself. A dozen small, mostly unconscious recalibrations happening at once as the people present absorb a new addition and quietly reorganize around it. Someone straightens. Someone angles slightly toward you. Someone's face lifts a fraction or does not. Each of these tiny shifts is a small, involuntary vote on how your arrival was received, and the sum of all the votes in a room produces the specific, felt atmosphere you sense the moment you step through the door, before a single greeting has actually been exchanged. Most people would swear they did not shift at all. Since the shifting happens beneath the threshold, most people monitor in themselves, which is exactly what makes it worth trusting. An aggregate reaction too widespread and too automatic to have been staged for your benefit. This collective response is worth distinguishing from your own anxiety about entering a room, since the two feel similar but come from different sources. One, an external, measurable shift in the people around you. The other, an internal state you brought in with you. A useful test is whether the feeling changes depending on which room you enter, since a feeling that stays identical everywhere probably belongs to you, while one that shifts sharply is likely tracking something real about how each group is responding to you. Notice, too, the rooms where the shift on your arrival is consistently warm, regardless of your own mood that day, since a welcome that holds steady across your own bad days and good ones is a more reliable signal than a welcome that only ever seems to appear when you are already feeling confident. Notice, the next time you enter a familiar room, the feeling that arrives before the conversation starts, the sense of welcome or its absence, and let that immediate read stand as real data rather than something you talked yourself into imagining. The signs were always there. Nothing this tier has named was ever actually hidden, only unlabeled, running the entire time beneath conversations you were fully present for, in the timing of a reply, the direction of a foot, the tone wrapped around your own name. All of it arriving continuously through channels that never once depended on the words being spoken over them. What changes, once you notice this, is not the amount of information available to you, since the information was always exactly this abundant, but your willingness to trust a channel you were taught, gently and repeatedly, to consider less reliable than speech, when in practice it has usually been the more honest of the two. The words were always the edited version, rehearsed for the listener's comfort and the speaker's protection, while the body kept running its own broadcast in parallel, mostly unsupervised, mostly unedited, mostly true. None of this requires becoming suspicious of everyone around you, only becoming a slightly better listener to the parts of every exchange that were never verbal to begin with. There is a particular relief available once this settles in properly, since it means you were never actually as unaware as you may have feared, missing every important signal, blind to what was happening in front of you. When the truer story is that you were receiving nearly all of it, continuously, and simply had not yet been given permission to trust what your own senses had already gathered. The 11 signs this tier has named, the smile, the pause, the reply, the feet, the mirroring, the laugh, the name, the distance, the eyes, the room, are not a checklist to memorize so much as a reminder of a fluency you were born with and have been quietly using your entire life, whether or not you ever called it by these particular names. Notice, over the coming days, how much of what people have been telling you arrived through everything except their sentences, and let that noticing settle in gently as the foundation the rest of this hour is going to keep building on. The arms that close when you speak. You are mid-sentence, nothing accusatory in your tone, when the arms across from you fold, not dramatically, just a small closing that happens somewhere around your third or fourth word and stays there for the rest of what you are saying. Crossed arms get read as defensiveness so reflexively that the reading has become a cliché, and clichés earn that status by being right often enough to survive, though the crossing can also mean nothing more than a cold room or a habitual resting posture that has nothing to do with you at all. What actually carries the information is not the position itself, but the timing, whether the arms were open a moment ago and closed at a specific point in the conversation, since a barrier that appears in direct response to a particular sentence is doing something a barrier that has been there the whole time is not. The body builds the wall. The mouth is too polite to build, protecting itself from content the social mind has decided to receive with a smile anyway. And the protecting timed precisely to your words, rather than to the room's temperature, tells you which sentence actually landed as a threat. This is worth separating from simple comfort-seeking too, since some people cross their arms the way others cross their legs, an unremarkable resting position that has nothing defensive in it at all. And the difference between the habit and the response is almost always visible in how suddenly the arms move and how tightly they stay closed afterward. A slow settle, reading very differently from a fast, hard fold. It also helps to notice what the arms do once the uncomfortable subject has passed, since a genuine defensive crossing loosens again once the threat has cleared, while a purely habitual crossing simply stays wherever it was. Notice the arms that close in front of you and what you had just said when they closed, and let the closing be read as a comment on the sentence, rather than dismissed as coincidence. The touch that tests the water. A hand rests briefly on your arm during a story that was not especially dramatic, gone again almost before you register it happened, light enough to be entirely deniable if you had reacted badly, deliberate enough that it clearly was not an accident. This kind of touch functions less like an accident and more like a question, sent without words to find out whether closeness of this kind is welcome, and your response, the almost imperceptible lean toward it, or the almost imperceptible stiffening away, is the answer the toucher is quietly waiting for before deciding whether to try again. The genius of the testing touch, if genius is the right word, is that it lets the toucher retreat with dignity if the answer comes back negative, no verbal commitment ever having been made, no rejection ever having technically occurred, both people free to pretend the moment did not carry the weight it clearly carried. A touch that is met with warmth tends to produce more touching, a small escalation over subsequent meetings, while a touch met with tension produces a quiet withdrawal, the toucher absorbing the answer and adjusting future behavior accordingly, often without either person ever discussing what just happened out loud. This entire negotiation, briefer than a sentence and far more honest than most sentences, settles the physical boundaries of a relationship long before either person would think to raise the subject directly, which is part of why so many people can tell you exactly how physically close they are, allowed to get with someone without ever once having discussed it. There is also a useful distinction between the touch that lingers a fraction longer than a casual gesture requires and the touch that is genuinely brief and purely functional. A handshake. A steadying hand on a crowded stair, the extra half-second being exactly the part that turns an ordinary gesture into a quiet question. Notice the touches that felt like questions, tentative and testing. And notice, too, how your own body answered before your mind had time to decide anything on purpose. The lean that reveals interest. Across a table, a conversation is unfolding normally, words moving back and forth at an ordinary pace, and somewhere in the middle of it, you notice the other person's torso has drifted several inches closer than it started, a small, forward tilt that arrived without any conscious decision on their part, the way a plant tilts toward a window. It never consulted anyone about facing. The lean is one of the more reliable tells available precisely because it is hard to produce convincingly on command, genuine interest generating an actual, felt pull toward the source of that interest, while a faked lean tends to carry a visible stiffness, held rather than fallen into, performed rather than experienced. The reverse lean, the pulling back, the retreat into the chair, is equally informative and considerably easier to miss, since a body creating distance rarely announces the creating. It simply, quietly, removes itself a few degrees at a time until the physical gap between two people has widened without either party naming the widening. What makes the lean worth tracking across a whole conversation rather than a single moment is that it moves, responding in real time to what is actually being said, drawing closer during the parts that land and drifting back during the parts that do not, producing a kind of live transcript of engagement, running silently underneath the verbal one. There is a version of the lean worth distinguishing from genuine interest, the polite lean produced by manners rather than pull, held too evenly and released too promptly, while the involuntary lean keeps drifting back toward you across a conversation without the person seeming to notice. The most reliable version, in fact, is not any single lean, but the accumulation of many small ones across an evening, each return small enough to seem accidental and consistent enough to stop looking like one. Notice who leans toward you when you speak and who leans away, and let the leaning tell you something the conversation's content, however pleasant, was never actually built to say. The jaw that tightens around you. Somewhere in an otherwise calm exchange, a muscle at the corner of someone's jaw pulls visibly tight, held there for a beat or two before releasing. Small enough that most people in the room would never register it, and large enough that, once you know to look, you cannot easily unsee it. This particular tell is close to impossible to fake or suppress on command, because the masseter muscle answers primarily to the body's stress response rather than to conscious instruction, clenching when a person is holding back anger, disagreement, or a reaction they have decided, for whatever reason, not to display openly. The jaw is managing something the mouth has been told to keep quiet about, and the managing, visible in the tightening, the faint bulge along the muscle, sometimes an audible grind. If the moment stretches on, reveals a held emotion with a precision. The person's composed expression is actively working to contradict. What makes this signal especially useful is that it tends to arrive at a specific, locatable point in a conversation rather than sitting there constantly, meaning you can often trace it directly back to whatever sentence, question, or silence produced it, giving you not just the fact of the tension, but its actual source. There is a version of this worth catching in yourself as much as in others, since your own jaw will often clench before you have consciously decided you are upset about something. The body's stress response arriving well ahead of the mind's willingness to name the feeling directly, which is worth checking for. The next time a conversation leaves you unaccountably tense, watching for the tightening in someone else becomes considerably easier once you have practiced noticing it reliably in yourself first, the muscle and the sensation being identical regardless of whose face happens to be carrying it in that particular moment. Notice the jaws that tighten around you and what was being said in the exact moment they tightened, since the timing, more than the tension itself, tells you precisely what the conversation was carefully not saying out loud. The breathing that changes near you. Somewhere beneath the words of an ordinary exchange, a person's breathing has shifted, shallower than it was a minute ago, or deeper, or briefly caught altogether at something you said. A rhythm change so quiet that neither of you would think to mention it, and so consistent, once you start listening for it, that it becomes almost impossible to ignore. Breathing sits under the control of the autonomic nervous system, the same background machinery that manages heart rate and sweat, which means the changes it produces arrive without permission from the conscious mind and, more importantly, without much ability for the conscious mind to override them convincingly. Shallow, quickened breathing tends to accompany anxiety or nervous energy. Deeper, slower breathing tends to accompany comfort, ease, or a particular kind of pleasant arousal. A sudden catch, a held breath, a small gasp, tends to accompany genuine surprise or emotional impact that arrived faster than the social mind could prepare a response for. Each of these is a data point the respiratory system broadcasts continuously and almost entirely without editing, since very few people spend a conversation consciously monitoring and adjusting their own breath the way they monitor their words. Breathing is also unusually easy to sense, even when you are not looking directly at someone. Audible in a quiet room, visible in the rise and fall of a shoulder at the edge of your vision, felt against your own body if you happen to be sitting close enough, which makes it one of the few nonverbal signals you can pick up on almost by accident, without ever needing to study someone's face for it deliberately. This is part of why a room can feel tense before anyone says a word, breathing shortening in near unison, a feedback loop of shared physiology running underneath the conversation. Notice the breathing of people around you this week, the shallow breath of nervousness, the settled sigh of comfort, the catch at an unexpected moment, and let the noticing tell you something. The accompanying sentence, however calm it sounded, did not quite manage to hide. The shoulder that turns toward you. In a group conversation, several people are angled loosely toward the center of the circle, and one person's shoulders have rotated, subtly but unmistakably, toward you specifically. A larger, slower cousin of the lean, the whole upper body orienting toward whoever currently holds its actual interest. This kind of rotation functions as an orientation signal in the most literal sense, the body pointing its front, the most exposed and most communicative surface it has, toward the person it has decided, without asking permission from the conscious mind, deserves its full attention in that moment. A person can be technically speaking to someone else in a group, while their shoulders have already made a different choice entirely, turned toward you instead. And that contradiction, when you catch it, tells you more about where the actual interest is sitting than the words being addressed to the other person ever will. The turn is also directional, in a way worth tracking over time, since a shoulder that starts a conversation angled away and gradually rotates toward you across several minutes is documenting a shifting interest in real time, a live record of engagement building that most people never notice they are producing. The signal becomes especially readable in settings with a natural center of attention, a dinner table, a small circle of chairs, since the default orientation is toward whoever is currently speaking, and a shoulder that stays turned toward you even after someone else takes over is a small defection worth more than it first appears. This is easiest to test retroactively, recalling a specific gathering and how the group was actually arranged, and noticing which bodies had quietly oriented toward which people, regardless of where the spoken conversation itself happened to be pointed at any given moment. Notice the shoulders that have turned toward you and the shoulders that have turned away, in group settings especially, and let the body's front, wherever it is actually pointed, tell you where the person's real attention has settled, regardless of who they are technically addressing. The hands that tell you everything. While a conversation runs its ordinary course through words, a second, parallel conversation is running through someone's hands. Open palms turning outward during an honest moment, fingers steepled during a confident one, a thumb worrying at a ring, a hand rising unconsciously to touch a neck or a jaw the instant something uncomfortable gets said. Hands sit in an unusual position in the body's hierarchy of self-monitoring, watched far less carefully than the face, which most people manage with real deliberateness, and precisely because the hands operate in the periphery of self-awareness rather than its center, they tend to be considerably more honest, producing a continuous stream of gestures the conscious mind rarely bothers to edit or even notice it is generating. Open visible palms tend to accompany honesty and openness. Clenched or hidden hands tend to accompany tension or something being withheld. Self-touching, the fidgeting with hair, jewelry, or clothing, tends to accompany discomfort or a bid for self-soothing that the person is not consciously aware they are performing. Watch particularly for what the hands do at the exact moment a difficult question lands, since a hand that suddenly finds something to hold, a cup, a pen, the edge of a table, is often bracing against a discomfort the face has already agreed to hide. There is a particular usefulness in watching the hands, specifically when the face is doing something practiced. A fixed smile, a carefully neutral expression, since the hands rarely receive the same rehearsal budget as the face, and will often keep moving, gesturing, or adjusting in ways that quietly contradict the stillness being maintained just above them. Recorded video makes this unusually easy to test after the fact, watching a person's hands on a slow delay and noticing activity you missed entirely the first time through, absorbed as you were by the face doing all the talking. Notice the hands during your next few conversations rather than only the face, and let their busy, largely unmonitored activity tell you something the more carefully managed features were not going to volunteer. The posture that shifts when you arrive. The instant you walk into a room, before a greeting has been exchanged, someone's posture has already responded. Spine straightening or shoulders curling inward, chest opening or arms drawing protectively across it. A reaction produced faster than the social mind could compose the polite version it intends to display a second later. This first involuntary shift functions as a kind of unedited draft, the body's honest, unrehearsed response to your presence arriving before the conscious performance has time to load, and first drafts, in this particular domain, tend to be considerably more reliable than whatever gets written over them once the social mind catches up. A person who straightens when you arrive is a person whose body has decided you are worth the effort good posture requires. A person who shrinks slightly is a person whose body has registered something closer to threat or discomfort. A person who does not shift at all, whose posture holds perfectly steady through your arrival, is often a person whose body has filed you as neutral, present but not particularly significant either way. None of these reactions are chosen consciously, which is precisely what makes them worth trusting over whatever warm greeting follows a half-second later, since the greeting had time to be composed and the shift did not. Catching this first instant reliably takes a bit of practice, since it happens fast and most people are looking at a face rather than a whole posture in the moment of walking into a room, but it becomes considerably easier once you deliberately widen your attention for the first second or two of any entrance, taking in the shoulders and the spine along with the expression rather than the expression alone. Over time, this becomes almost automatic, a habit of reading a room's collective posture the way you might once have only read its collective face. Notice how bodies respond in the first instant of your arrival, before any words are exchanged, and let that instant, rather than the greeting that follows it, carry the greater share of the truth. The fidgeting that means discomfort. A foot taps under a table at a rhythm that has nothing to do with any music playing. A pen clicks open and shut. For the third time in a minute, fingers find the hem of a sleeve and worry at it steadily. None of it purposeful in any practical sense, and all of it, taken together, discharging a restlessness that has to go somewhere because the person producing it has decided not to say what is actually causing it. Fidgeting is rarely random, even though it looks that way, since the specific type, location, and intensity of the movement tends to track the specific emotional state producing it. Meaning, fidgeting that intensifies the moment a particular subject comes up is telling you something quite different from fidgeting that intensifies steadily as a long meeting drags on. Fidgeting that appears specifically and reliably in your presence, rather than as a general habit visible with everyone, deserves particular attention, since it suggests your presence itself, rather than the general circumstances of the day, is producing a state the person's body cannot sit comfortably inside of, whether that state is discomfort, nervous excitement, or something in between the two. The person fidgeting rarely knows they are doing it, which is exactly what makes the signal worth reading. An unmonitored discharge of energy the emotional system produces because it has nowhere sanctioned to put the feeling instead. It is worth separating this from a person's general temperament too, since some people fidget constantly regardless of context. A baseline restlessness that has little to do with any particular conversation, and the useful signal is not the fidgeting itself, but the change in it. An unusually still person suddenly tapping, or an unusually restless person suddenly going quiet, either shift marking a departure from that specific person's normal pattern. Notice the fidgeting in people around you this week, the tapping, the clicking, the small repeated adjustments, and let it tell you what the person sitting still on the surface has decided not to say out loud. The stillness that means attention. Somewhere in the middle of something you are saying, the small, constant background movement that normally accompanies any conversation, the shifting weight, the idle glance, the minor adjustments of a body that is only partly engaged, simply stops. The whole person going quiet and motionless in a way that reads, once you notice it, as considerably more flattering than any compliment could manage. This kind of stillness tends to arrive when a person's attention has become so fully occupied by what they are hearing that the resources normally spent on peripheral, idle movement have been redirected entirely toward processing your words, the physical self falling silent, because the mental self has claimed everything for itself. It is one of the more difficult signals to fake convincingly, since a performed stillness, held on purpose to seem attentive, tends to carry a slightly rigid, effortful quality that genuine resource-redirected stillness simply does not have. The real version looking closer to absorption than to discipline. A person who goes still while you speak has, in effect, handed you their entire system, rather than merely their polite attention, and the handing over, involuntary and complete, communicates a regard that a nodding, fidgeting kind of listening never quite manages to convey with the same weight. The stillness is also worth noticing in yourself, since your own body going quiet in the presence of someone speaking is a reliable, honest report on how fully their words have actually captured you. A report considerably more trustworthy than whatever polite nodding you might have offered out of simple habit or social obligation. Learning to catch this in your own body first tends to make it far easier to recognize in someone else, the sensation being identical regardless of which side of the conversation you happen to be sitting on. Notice the moments you have produced this kind of stillness in someone else, and let the memory of it stand as one of the more genuine forms of validation a body can offer another body without a single word passing between them. The micro-expression you almost caught. Something crosses a face for less time than it takes to blink, gone before you could name it, leaving behind only a faint residue of unease, a sense that something briefly did not match, even though you could not have said, if asked directly, what exactly you saw. This is the territory Paul Ekman mapped when he identified micro-expressions, the involuntary facial configurations that flash across a face in less than a quarter of a second, appearing before the conscious mind has time to intervene and construct the version it actually intends to display, revealing, in that brief window, a genuine emotional response the social mask has not yet arrived to replace. The micro-expressions of contempt, disgust, fear, and surprise move fast enough that most untrained observers cannot consciously identify which specific emotion they witnessed, and yet the emotional residue tends to register anyway, filed by some faster, older part of the perceiving mind, even while the conscious, naming part remains a full step behind. This is part of why a person can occasionally walk away from an otherwise pleasant conversation with an unexplained unease they cannot source. Having caught, without knowing they caught it, a flash of something the other person's face said and then immediately unsaid. Learning to catch these deliberately takes real, dedicated practice, the kind Ekman's own training programs were built around, slowing footage frame by frame until the eye adjusts to a speed it was never built to track. But you do not need the formal training to benefit from it, since the feeling a micro-expression leaves behind arrives whether or not you can consciously identify what produced it. Trust that leftover feeling the way you might trust a smell you cannot quite place. A signal your slower naming mind has not caught up to yet, but your older perception has already fully processed. Notice the moments a fast flicker crosses someone's face, gone before you could name it, and let the feeling it left behind be trusted as more accurate than the calm expression that returned a heartbeat later. The throat that clears before speaking. A small, unremarkable sound arrives just before a difficult sentence, a brief clearing of the throat that has nothing to do with any actual congestion, functioning instead as a kind of announcement, a tiny ritual the body performs to buy itself half a second before delivering words. It is not entirely comfortable saying. The clearing is rarely about the throat at all. It is about timing, a small, physical delay that gives the speaker one last beat to settle on a final version of whatever is about to be said, and the needing of that extra beat tells you, before a single word arrives, that the coming sentence required some kind of preparation, rather than simply falling out naturally, the way easy, comfortable statements tend to. This particular tell is easy to dismiss precisely because it is so small and so common, a background noise most people never register consciously. And yet its placement, arriving reliably right before uncertain, weighty, or uncomfortable content, and rarely before easy content, makes it a surprisingly consistent predictor once you start paying attention to when it shows up, rather than simply hearing it as static. Recall the throat clears that preceded something difficult being said to you, and notice how the small sound itself functioned as an unintentional preview, announcing, however quietly, that whatever came next had cost something to produce. It is also worth listening for the clearing that arrives mid-sentence rather than before one, since that version marks the exact point where the speaker realized, partway through, that the sentence was heading somewhere more exposed than intended, and the clearing functions as a brief, unconscious pause to reconsider the route before continuing. Once you start listening for this pattern, it becomes hard to unhear, a small punctuation mark scattered through speech that most people produce daily without noticing. Notice the clearing this week before people say something that matters, and let the small sound stand as an honest, involuntary warning that the words to follow were not entirely easy to release. The body never learned to lie. Everything this tier has named, the arms, the touch, the lean, the jaw, the breath, the shoulder, the hands, the posture, the fidgeting, the stillness, the flickering expression, the small clearing of a throat, points toward the same underlying fact that the physical body, for all the social mind's determined efforts to train it otherwise, has never fully mastered the art of deception the way the mouth has. Words can be rehearsed, revised, and delivered with real precision, chosen carefully to serve the speaker's comfort or agenda rather than the listener's understanding. But the body keeps running its own, largely unsupervised broadcast in parallel, unable to manage every channel at once, and so it leaks, consistently, across dozens of small signals that the conscious mind simply does not have the bandwidth to simultaneously control. A person actively trying to hide what they actually think is, in practice, fighting a losing war against their own physiology. Managing the face while the hands fidget, controlling the voice while the jaw clenches, performing calm while the breath shortens, 3 or 4 separate channels leaking, even while a single one is being carefully, deliberately held together. This is not a reason to distrust every person you meet, only a reason to notice that the body has always been offering a second, more honest account running underneath whatever the mouth has chosen to say, available to anyone patient enough to notice it. None of these 12 separate signals require any special talent or training to read, only a redirection of attention away from the mouth, which is where most people have been taught to listen almost exclusively since childhood, and toward the rest of the body, which has been talking the entire time, regardless of whether anyone was paying it any attention at all. Notice how much truth has been available to you this entire hour through channels that never once depended on a single word, and let that noticing settle in as the foundation the rest of this video is going to keep returning to. The word they keep repeating. Across several conversations, you notice the same word surfacing again and again from the same person. Honestly. Fine. Trust. A word that has nothing structurally necessary about its repetition and yet keeps appearing anyway. Inserted into sentences where a dozen other words would have served the grammar just as well. A word repeated this often is rarely a habit in the empty sense of the term. It is closer to a leak. The unconscious mind pushing a particular term to the surface because that term corresponds to something the speaker is currently preoccupied with beneath the level of deliberate thought. The person who keeps saying honestly is often someone whose relationship to honesty is under some private strain. The person who keeps saying fine is very often someone for whom things are measurably not fine. The person who keeps insisting trust me is frequently someone who senses, correctly, that trust between you has become a live question rather than a settled fact. None of this works as a rigid formula applied mechanically to every conversation, but the pattern, tracked patiently across weeks rather than judged from a single sentence, tends to point reliably at whatever is actually occupying a person's mind, regardless of what the conversation is nominally about on the surface. This is worth listening for in your own speech too, since the words you find yourself repeating without quite noticing are very often doing the same quiet work, surfacing a preoccupation you have not yet consciously named to yourself, let alone to anyone else in the room. This is easiest to catch with people you see regularly, since the repetition only becomes visible across multiple separate conversations spread over time. A single exchange rarely giving you enough data to notice a pattern that only reveals itself once several instances have accumulated and started to rhyme with each other in a way that stops looking accidental. Notice the words that keep reappearing in the people around you, and let the repetition, rather than any single sentence, tell you where their attention has actually been living. The compliment that was not a compliment. Someone tells you that you look great for your age, or that they admire how relaxed you manage to be about something they would find unbearable. The sentence arriving dressed as praise while carrying, somewhere folded inside it, a small blade you only feel a moment after the words have finished landing. This is the backhanded compliment, one of the more sophisticated instruments available in ordinary conversation, delivering a genuine criticism while maintaining full social cover, since the wrapping of praise makes the criticism difficult to challenge without you appearing thin-skinned or ungrateful for what was, on its face, a kind remark. The effectiveness of the backhanded compliment depends almost entirely on this exact confusion, the recipient left wondering whether they are overreacting to something genuinely warm. And that self-doubt is not incidental. It is the entire mechanism. The criticism landing while the recipient is busy questioning their own right to feel criticized in the first place. What distinguishes a backhanded compliment from an honest, slightly clumsy one is usually the specificity of the sting. A clumsy compliment simply lacks polish, while a backhanded one contains a precisely targeted comparison, an implied baseline you are being measured against and found only conditionally acceptable within. There is also a version of this that arrives entirely on accident, from someone who has genuinely not noticed the second layer riding underneath their own words, and distinguishing the accidental from the deliberate usually comes down to whether the pattern repeats across many interactions or only surfaces once, under obvious strain. It helps, too, to notice whether a particular person's compliments consistently carry this quality, or whether it was a one-off slip, since the pattern across many exchanges is a far more reliable diagnostic than any single sentence, and a person capable of complimenting you warmly and cleanly most of the time deserves a different reading than a person whose praise almost always arrives with something small and sharp folded quietly inside it. Notice the compliments that leave you feeling smaller rather than larger, and let that specific, worse feeling be trusted over the polite words that produced it. The question with a known answer. Someone asks you something they clearly already know the answer to. The phrasing careful, almost too careful. The tone light in a way that does not quite match the weight sitting underneath the sentence, and something in you senses correctly that this is not really a request for information at all. A question like this functions as a test disguised as curiosity, the asker already holding the answer and using the asking to observe how you respond, watching, not for the content of what you say, but for the pause before it. The shift in your posture, the small tell that reveals whether your answer matches what they already privately know to be true. This kind of question is a trap only in the sense that most traps are, built not to punish you for lying, but to reveal, with more clarity than a direct accusation ever could, whether you are willing to tell the truth when you believe you have a choice about it. The advantage this gives the asker is considerable, since they get to observe your honest, unguarded first response, while you believe yourself to still be operating with the freedom of a genuinely open question. An asymmetry that only becomes visible once you realize, often after the fact, that the question was never actually open to begin with. This is also worth recognizing in the reverse. The moments you yourself have asked a question you already knew the answer to. Testing someone you love, rather than simply asking them directly for the truth, since the same mechanism runs in both directions and reveals as much about the asker's trust as it does about the answerer's honesty. The tone of these questions often carries an unhurried patience. Genuine curiosity rarely bothers with, since real curiosity wants the answer quickly, while a question already holding its own answer can afford to wait comfortably. Notice the questions that feel loaded, even though the words themselves sound simple, and let that felt weight tell you the asker was testing rather than merely wondering. The joke that was not really a joke. A comment lands inside a joke, technically funny enough to earn a laugh from the room, and yet something about it stings, in a way an ordinary joke does not. A small, precise truth delivered under the cover of comedy so that, if you react to the content rather than the humor, the speaker can retreat instantly behind. I was only joking, leaving you looking like the one who cannot take a joke. The comedic frame is doing real structural work here, functioning as one of the only socially sanctioned channels through which a person can say something genuinely meant and then withdraw it, deniably, the instant it lands badly. Protection the same sentence would never enjoy if delivered plainly and seriously. A joke that stings this precisely was usually aimed with real intention, the humor serving less as entertainment and more as a delivery mechanism for a message the speaker wanted communicated but did not want to formally own. And the not owning, built directly into the joke's structure, means the message arrives without the accountability a direct statement would have required. What separates a joke like this from ordinary, harmless teasing is usually the aftertaste. Genuine teasing leaves warmth behind even when it stings briefly, while a joke that was really a message tends to leave something colder, a small residue of having been assessed and found wanting rather than simply affectionately teased. There is also a version worth recognizing in group settings, the joke told at your expense, that would sound far more exposed if said to you privately. The audience providing cover for a message that might not have survived being delivered without witnesses. Notice, in those moments, whether the laughter feels genuinely light or slightly held, since a room that laughs a beat too carefully has often registered the same sting. Notice the jokes that leave a specific, cooler kind of aftertaste, and let that aftertaste, rather than the laughter that accompanied it, tell you what was actually being communicated underneath the comedy. The subject they always change. Every time a particular topic edges toward the surface of a conversation, you notice the same person steering neatly away from it, sometimes with a joke, sometimes with a question about something else entirely, sometimes with a subtle but unmistakable pivot that leaves you talking about anything except the thing you had actually been approaching. A subject that gets deflected consistently across many separate conversations and often across many months is rarely being avoided by accident, since accidental avoidance tends to be inconsistent, sometimes landing on the topic and sometimes not, while a genuinely charged subject produces the same reliable swerve every single time it comes near. The deflection itself functions as a kind of map, showing you, indirectly, exactly where the sensitive territory is located, even though the person doing the deflecting has never once told you directly what that territory contains. The way a fence around an empty-looking field tells you there is something worth protecting inside it, even before you have seen what that something actually is. Much of the time, the person changing the subject does not consciously register that they are doing it, the redirection happening automatically, the social mind steering away from discomfort before the conscious mind has fully registered the topic's approach, which is part of what makes the pattern so reliable, an automatic avoidance being harder to fake than a deliberate one. It is worth distinguishing this from ordinary boredom too, since a person who simply finds a topic dull will change it inconsistently, drifting away sometimes and staying engaged, other times depending on mood, while a genuinely charged subject produces the same reliable swerve nearly every time. A consistency that ordinary boredom, drifting, and inconsistent by nature rarely manages to reproduce with such reliable precision. Notice the subjects that always seem to get changed around a particular person, and let the changing, more than any conversation you eventually manage to have about it, mark the exact boundary of what that person is protecting. How much detail they give you. Ask two different people about their weekend, and one hands you a bare outline, fine, nothing much, while the other hands you a small, textured world, the specific weather, the argument with a sibling, the meal that turned out better than expected, and the difference between the two responses is rarely about how eventful either weekend actually was. Detail is effort, and the amount of effort a person invests in describing their own life to you tends to track quite closely with how much they value your presence in that description, the elaborate answer being, in its own quiet way, an invitation, a decision to let you further inside, rather than simply handing you the minimum required to satisfy the social obligation of having asked. The person who gives you rich, specific detail is building something for you out of their own experience, constructing a small, shared world you can actually stand inside, rather than merely glimpse from outside. And that construction, however casual it looks, requires a willingness that a guarded person rarely extends by accident. The person who gives you almost nothing is not necessarily hiding something dramatic. Sometimes it is simple habit or fatigue, but the pattern, sustained across many exchanges, still tells you something real about how much interior access you have actually been granted, regardless of how warm the surface tone happens to be in any single conversation. This works in reverse too, and is worth noticing about your own habits, since the amount of detail you offer other people when they ask about your life is quietly telling them the same thing about how much room you have made for them, an unconscious signal running in both directions at once, quietly, regardless of which side of the question you happen to currently be sitting on. Notice how much texture people offer you when you ask about their lives, and let the amount, more than the content, tell you how far inside they have decided to let you. The name they never use for you. Certain people you eventually notice almost never say your name directly, reaching instead for hey or you, or simply beginning sentences without any address at all. A small, consistent absence that would be easy to miss if it were not so oddly reliable across every single interaction you have with them. A name carries a particular kind of intimacy that generic address quietly avoids, since using someone's name is a small act of specific recognition, an acknowledgement that you are this particular person, rather than an interchangeable presence in the room. And the avoidance of the name sidesteps exactly that acknowledgement, keeping the interaction at a level of generality the name, if used, would immediately personalize. This avoidance rarely announces itself as a decision. Most people who avoid a name could not tell you they were doing it if asked directly, which is part of what makes the pattern worth trusting. An unconscious sidestep being harder to fake than a deliberate warmth would be to perform. The discomfort underneath the avoidance can come from several places: genuine dislike, an uncertain read on the relationship's actual closeness, or simply an awkwardness the person has never examined. But whatever the source, the effect on you is consistent. A name that never quite gets used leaves a small, specific coolness that no amount of otherwise friendly conversation fully closes over. Pay attention, too, to what happens if you gently start using someone's name more often yourself, since the shift often produces an unconscious mirroring. A person who had been avoiding your name may begin using it a little more freely once you have modeled the intimacy first, which tells you the earlier avoidance was, in most ordinary cases, more likely habit or shyness than any genuine coldness toward you specifically. Notice who says your name easily and often, and who seems to route around it entirely, and let that quiet, unspoken difference register as real information about the closeness on offer. The story they tell about other people. A friend describes, at length and with obvious feeling, a colleague's terrible relationship, the details oddly specific, the emotional charge oddly intense for a story that is technically about someone else's life rather than their own. And something in the telling suggests you are not actually hearing about the colleague at all. Stories about third parties frequently function as a safe container for the storyteller's own material. Feelings and experiences, too vulnerable to disclose, directly getting projected onto a convenient stand-in who can be discussed at length without the teller ever having to say, "I feel this myself." The person who talks at length about a friend's fear is often quietly confessing their own. The person who dwells on a colleague's unfair treatment is often processing an unfairness closer to home that has not yet found its own direct language. The third party functions as a screen, and the material projected onto that screen belongs, more often than the framing admits, to the person doing the projecting, rather than to the person the story is nominally about. What gives this away, usually, is the heat. A story about someone else delivered with a specificity and an emotional charge that a purely observational account would not require. The intensity itself being the clue that the teller is standing closer to this material than the framing lets on. This is worth watching for in your own storytelling as well, since the third party you find yourself discussing most intensely, most often, with the most unresolved feeling attached, is very likely a screen for something in your own life. You have not yet found the more direct, more vulnerable language to say, plainly, the story about someone else quietly doing the work of a confession you have not yet been ready to make. Notice the stories people tell you about other people, and let the energy behind the telling, rather than the third party's name attached to it, point you toward who the story is actually about. The promise that sounds too easy. Someone agrees to something with a lightness that does not match the size of what is actually being asked. Of course, no problem, absolutely, the words arriving fast and airy, and something in the speed itself makes the agreement feel less solid than the words alone would suggest. A promise made without the weight, a genuine commitment usually carries. An easy promise is often a promise that skipped the actual evaluation. The person agreeing not because they carefully considered the commitment and decided to honor it, but because agreeing was, in that specific moment, simpler than negotiating or discussing. The yes functioning as a way to end an uncomfortable exchange, rather than as a genuine pledge to follow through later. A promise that is actually meant tends to arrive with a small, visible weight attached to it. A pause, a moment of consideration, sometimes even a flicker of reluctance that reflects genuine awareness of what is being taken on. And that weight, entirely absent from the easy promise, is precisely what distinguishes the commitment worth trusting from the one that was really just a pleasant sound offered to close a conversation. This is not always deliberate deception. Plenty of people make easy promises with genuinely good intentions and simply lack the follow-through to match the lightness of their agreement. But the pattern, once you notice it repeating with a particular person, becomes a more reliable predictor of future behavior than the sincerity in their voice at the moment the promise was actually made. There is a useful test available in the moment itself, gently naming the size of what you are actually asking for before accepting the easy yes, since a person who is genuinely willing will usually meet that clarification with continued ease, while a person who agreed only to end the conversation will often, at that point, quietly begin to hedge. Notice the promises delivered too lightly and too quickly, and let that lightness, rather than the warmth of the tone, predict how likely the promise is to actually be kept. The way they talk about your absence. Word reaches you, secondhand, about something someone said about you when you were not in the room, and the report lands differently than anything they have ever said directly to your face, because speech that occurs in your absence has no audience left to manage, no politeness left to maintain for your benefit, and is therefore closer to the person's actual, unrehearsed thought about you than almost anything said while you were present to hear it. The person who speaks warmly of you when you are not there is revealing a regard that survived your departure, a positive assessment that did not require your presence to be maintained, which tells you the warmth was never simply a performance staged for your benefit in the first place. The person who speaks less generously in your absence, minimizing your accomplishments, adding a subtle qualifier that was never present in their direct praise, is revealing that the warmth you receive to your face is doing different work than the honest assessment happening once you have left the room. This is, admittedly, uncomfortable information to seek out deliberately, and most people encounter it only by accident, through an overheard conversation or a friend's careless slip. But the discomfort of hearing it does not make it any less accurate, since a person's unaudienced speech about you is, almost by definition, closer to their private truth than their carefully managed speech in front of you could ever manage to be. There is also a gentler version of this available without needing gossip or a careless slip to reach you, simply paying attention to how a person speaks about other absent people in front of you, since the pattern they use for a third party in their absence is very likely the same pattern being applied to you the moment you are the one who has left the room. Notice, when it reaches you, how someone speaks about you when you were not there to hear it, and let that unguarded account carry more weight than the performance you received directly. The qualifier that weakens everything. A sentence arrives with a small word tucked in near the front of it, I guess. Sort of, kind of maybe. A modest hedge that most people barely register consciously, and yet that quietly reduces the entire statement's commitment, softening a claim to the point where, if challenged later, the speaker has already built themselves an exit. They never had to announce out loud. The qualifier is a small, verbal insurance policy, purchased in advance of any actual disagreement, a way of saying something while simultaneously reserving the right to have not quite meant it. And the reserving, however minor it sounds in the moment, tells you the speaker was never fully behind the statement to begin with. Someone who says, "I kind of like your idea," does not, in any meaningful sense, like your idea, the qualifier having already done the work of retracting most of the compliment before the compliment had finished arriving. Someone who says, "I guess we could try," is communicating reluctance dressed as tentative agreement, the guess carrying the actual content of the sentence, while the agreement is mostly decorative. These are not verbal tics to be dismissed as filler. They are small, advanced retractions, the speaker pulling back from full ownership of a claim before the sentence carrying it has even finished leaving their mouth, and learning to hear the qualifier as the most honest part of the sentence, rather than as harmless throat clearing, changes a great deal about how much weight you assign to what follows it. This is worth listening for in your own sentences too, since the qualifiers you reach for without thinking are quietly announcing your own reservations. Sometimes before you have consciously admitted to yourself that any reservation exists. The mouth arriving at the honest, hedged version of a feeling well before the mind has finished composing a more confident one. Notice the qualifiers that arrive in front of statements this week, and let the small, unassuming word carry more diagnostic weight than the larger, more confident sentence trailing behind it. The silence. After you share good news, you tell someone something genuinely good, a promotion, an achievement, a piece of long-awaited news, and there is a beat, brief but unmistakable, before the congratulations arrive, a gap that would be nothing at all if the following words were not otherwise so warm, and yet the gap changes how the warmth lands, leaving you with a small, hard-to-name unease underneath an entirely appropriate response. This particular silence is not thoughtfulness, since genuine delight at someone else's good fortune tends to arrive instantly and involuntarily, the face lighting before the mind has finished processing the sentence, the voice rising without deliberate effort. And any gap before that instinctive response suggests the instinctive response was not, in fact, delight, that something else arrived first and had to be managed before the socially appropriate reaction could be assembled and delivered. The something else is usually some version of comparison, envy, or a private recalibration of where the listener now stands relative to you. And while none of these reactions make a person a villain, since comparison is a nearly universal human reflex, the honest presence of that beat tells you the celebration you received was constructed rather than spontaneous. What makes this particularly worth noticing is how consistently it distinguishes people over time. The friends whose congratulations arrive instantly, every single time, from the ones whose warmth always seems to need that extra half-second of assembly first. It is worth being gentle with this observation too, since even people who genuinely love you can carry a complicated relationship to their own comparisons. And a single beat of silence after one piece of news is not a verdict on the entire relationship, only a data point worth adding to the much larger, more forgiving pattern you are building about a person across many pieces of both good and difficult news over time. Notice the silences that follow your good news, and let their length, more than the words that eventually fill them, tell you something true about how your success actually landed. The words that hide what they mean, everything this tier has traced, the repeated word, the backhanded compliment, the loaded question, the joke with a message inside it, the subject that always gets changed, the detail withheld or offered, the name never used, the story about someone else, the promise made too lightly, the talk that changes in your absence. The small qualifier, the silence after good news, points back to the same underlying truth. That spoken language is the most managed, most edited, most carefully constructed part of any human exchange, filtered through politeness, self-interest, and the fear of conflict, until the sentence that finally reaches you may bear only a loose resemblance to the thought that originally produced it. Words are not lies exactly, most of the time, but they are performances, chosen with at least half an eye on how they will land, on what they will cost the speaker. on what the listener is prepared to hear, which means the actual truth of a moment usually lives not in the sentence itself, but in everything crowded around it: the tone, the timing, the thing left unsaid, the topic quietly avoided. This does not mean every sentence anyone says to you is secretly hiding something. Most of the time, people mean roughly what they say. But it does mean the words alone were never designed to carry the whole message, only the portion that survived editing. None of this requires becoming a suspicious or exhausting listener, picking apart every sentence anyone offers you, since most of the time people mean roughly what they say. And the extra layer of attention is only worth applying when something in you has already, quietly and reliably, registered a small, unexplained mismatch worth investigating further before you let it go. Notice how much trust you have been extending to words alone, and let this hour's 12 signs stand as a reminder that the fuller truth has always been running just beside the sentence, waiting to be heard alongside it, rather than instead of it. How they introduce you to others. Someone brings you into a room full of strangers, and the sentence they choose to introduce you with lands with more weight than almost anything said afterward. A small, public framing that reveals not only how this person privately regards you, but how much of that regard they are willing to display in front of witnesses. A generous introduction carries specific, warm detail. This is my closest friend, the person who talked me through the worst year of my life. The sentence functioning as a small advertisement offered on your behalf without your having to ask for one, and the willingness to spend that social capital publicly tells you something a private compliment never quite manages to communicate. A minimal introduction, this is someone from work, delivered flatly, without elaboration, without warmth, is doing the opposite work, keeping your significance carefully contained, even while technically fulfilling the social obligation of naming you at all. The introduction is a kind of status conferred in public, and the conferring, because it happens in front of other people, carries a cost the person making the introduction has decided, consciously or not, is worth paying on your behalf, or is not. This is worth watching for over time rather than judging from a single instance, since nerves or unfamiliarity with a particular room can flatten anyone's introductions occasionally. But a consistent pattern across many rooms and many years becomes a far more reliable map of your actual standing than any single sentence delivered under pressure. There is a particular version of this worth watching for at gatherings where the introducer has some social standing to spend, a workplace event, a family holiday with relatives you rarely see, since the cost of a generous introduction rises with the size and importance of the audience, and a person willing to spend real social capital on you in exactly those higher stakes rooms is telling you something. A casual introduction among close friends, however warm, was never quite equipped to say. Notice how you have been introduced across your life, and let the pattern, rather than any single moment, tell you how highly you have actually been held. Whether they remember what you said. Weeks after a passing comment, someone brings it back up unprompted, a detail so small you had genuinely forgotten mentioning it, and the remembering lands with a warmth that a dozen more obvious compliments never quite managed to produce, because memory is not neutral, it is selective. And what gets selected reveals something about significance that the person doing the remembering rarely consciously controls. The brain files what it considers important and discards what it does not. An automatic, largely unmanaged process running beneath conscious decision, which means a person who retains the small, easily forgettable details of your life has, without meaning to announce it, filed you as worth the neurological cost of storage. The person who forgets what you told them yesterday, who asks the same question twice, who shows no trace of having absorbed what you shared, is not necessarily unkind, but their forgetting is still information. A quiet signal that your words did not register as significant enough to keep. This categorizing happens below the level of intention entirely. Nobody decides to forget on purpose in most cases, which is exactly what makes the pattern worth trusting more than a person's stated intentions, an involuntary process being harder to fake than a deliberate one. This is worth distinguishing from someone who takes deliberate notes or makes an obvious, visible effort to recall details on purpose, a kindness in its own right, but a genuinely different one. Since the effortless version, the small detail that simply resurfaces on its own months later without any visible strain behind it, tells you the storing happened automatically in the first place, driven by real interest, rather than by conscious diligence or careful planning ahead of time. Notice the people who recall the small, easily discarded details of what you have told them, and let their effortless recall stand as one of the more honest, unmanufactured forms of regard a person can offer, without ever announcing they are offering it. The effort they make when no one watches. A kindness arrives with no audience present to witness it, no social credit available for having performed it, nothing to gain from the gesture except the gesture itself. And something about that particular kindness carries more weight than an identical one performed in front of others, because effort spent without an audience has nowhere to go except toward you directly. Effort produced for an audience is, at least in part, performance, aimed as much at the impression it creates as at the person receiving it, while effort produced in complete privacy has no impression left to manage, meaning whatever motivation remains is aimed squarely and only at you. The person who is warm to you only when others are present is offering something calculated, however genuine it may also partly be, while the person who extends the same warmth when nobody will ever know is offering something considerably closer to unmixed regard. This distinction matters most in the small, unglamorous gestures, the favor done quietly, the message sent for no occasion, the consideration extended when there was no possibility of anyone finding out, each one a data point, uncorrupted by the desire to appear generous because nobody was in a position to witness the generosity at all. This is one of the harder signals to actually observe in real time, since by definition you are often not present when the unwitnessed effort occurs. But it tends to surface eventually, through a third party mentioning something offhand, or through simply noticing. In hindsight, how many small conveniences in your life turned out to have someone's quiet, unclaimed effort behind them? Effort that was never once announced or advertised at the time it was actually spent on your behalf. Notice the efforts made for you when there was no one else around to see them, and let those particular, unwitnessed gestures carry more evidential weight than any public display of the exact same care. How they behave when you are struggling. Difficulty has a way of stripping the ordinary social performance down to something closer to a person's actual architecture, revealing, often within days, what months of comfortable interaction never had reason to expose, since the easy days simply never asked anything difficult of anyone's regard. The person who shows up when you are struggling, who does not disappear the moment your presence requires more than casual maintenance, who sits with the discomfort of your pain rather than requiring you to manage their feelings about witnessing it, is demonstrating a regard that has been tested and has held. The person who grows quiet, who becomes suddenly busy, who offers words without any accompanying action, who seems more uncomfortable with your pain than concerned by it, is revealing a regard that depended, at least in part, on your remaining easy company, a condition the difficulty has now exposed rather than created. This does not mean the disappearing person never cared at all. Sometimes discomfort with pain reflects a person's own unresolved history rather than anything about you specifically. But the exposing still happened regardless of the explanation, and what it exposed is now available to you as real information about the relationship's actual load-bearing capacity. It is worth being careful here not to punish someone permanently for a single failure to show up, since people can be caught off guard, overwhelmed by their own circumstances, or simply unskilled at knowing how to be present without having yet learned better. But a pattern of disappearing across multiple difficulties, rather than one isolated instance, is a different matter entirely. A repeated absence that stops being explainable by bad timing and starts looking like an actual limit on what the relationship is structurally able to hold. Notice who remained present the last time you were genuinely struggling, and let that presence, or its absence, tell you something the comfortable, easy stretches of the relationship were never actually equipped to reveal. The way they handle your boundaries. You state a limit, calmly, without drama, and the response that follows tells you something about your own worth in this person's accounting more directly than almost any other single interaction could, because a boundary is, underneath its practical content, a small declaration that you matter enough to have limits, and the handling of that declaration is the handling of you. A boundary honored without negotiation, without a guilt trip disguised as concern, without the subtle pushing that dresses itself up as reasonable discussion, is a boundary that has been recognized as a legitimate extension of a person worth respecting. A boundary that gets tested, questioned, or quietly worn down over repeated attempts is being treated as an obstacle to someone's access rather than as a statement about you, which tells you, plainly, that access to you currently outranks respect for you in this particular relationship's actual priorities. This is one of the more reliable tests available precisely because it requires so little theater to observe. An ordinary limit stated in an ordinary moment produces a response almost immediately, unlike larger crises that take longer to reveal their information. There is a subtler version of this worth learning to catch too. The boundary that gets technically respected but is followed immediately by a mood, a coldness, a sudden withdrawal of the warmth that had been present a moment before. Since a boundary honored under visible protest is not quite the same thing as a boundary honored with genuine acceptance. And the difference between the two tends to be plainly readable in how the rest of the interaction unfolds afterward. A person whose warmth survives your limit intact has actually respected it. A person whose warmth cools the instant the limit is stated has complied with the letter of your request, while quietly registering an objection your boundary was never actually asked to accommodate. Notice how the people in your life respond the next time you name a limit clearly, and let their response, rather than their usual warmth, tell you the true rank you actually hold. Whether they include you or forget you, plans get made, and either your name comes up naturally, without prompting, as a fixture of whatever is being arranged, or it does not. An absence that rarely announces itself directly and is instead discovered later, secondhand, through a photograph or an offhand mention of an evening you were never told about. Inclusion is not a single event. It is a repeated choice, made again and again across many separate occasions. And the choosing, sustained over time, reveals whether you occupy a permanent place in someone's mental model of their social world, or whether you exist there only when something happens to remind them you exist. The person who includes you without needing a prompt is someone whose imagination of an evening automatically contains you, the way a familiar room automatically contains its furniture, while the person who only includes you after being reminded is someone whose mental model simply does not generate your presence on its own. This is rarely a hostile omission. Most forgetting is not malicious, but the omission is still honest, an unforced report on where you currently sit in someone's ongoing awareness rather than in their occasional memory of you. There is a specific, almost clinical way to test this without engineering an awkward confrontation, simply noticing, honestly, whether you have ever had to ask to be included somewhere. A genuinely close relationship would have included you automatically, since the asking itself, however small and however easily done, is a small confession that the automatic inclusion you were hoping for did not actually happen on its own. This does not mean every asked-for invitation reflects a cold relationship. Sometimes people are simply overwhelmed or forgetful across the board, but a pattern of needing to ask, sustained across enough occasions, is still telling you something real about where you sit in someone's unprompted awareness, regardless of how warmly they respond once you have done the asking for them. Notice who thinks of you without being prompted to, and who requires the reminder. And let that quiet, repeated pattern tell you something no single warm invitation, offered under obligation, ever fully could. How they react to your success. News of something good happening to you lands, and the reaction that follows arrives either instantly, unguarded, the face lighting before the mind has time to compose anything, or with a small, almost imperceptible pause. First, a beat of processing before the appropriate response gets assembled and delivered. And that beat, brief as it is, tells you something the eventual, perfectly worded congratulations cannot undo. Genuine delight at someone else's good fortune is, for most people who feel it, involuntary. The body's spontaneous reaction to good news arriving before any comparison, envy, or recalibration has had time to intrude and complicate it. The managed response, delayed by exactly that comparison, still arrives warmly in most cases, since most people are not cruel. But the warmth has been constructed rather than simply released, and the constructing, however brief, is detectable to anyone paying close attention to timing rather than only to content. This does not make comparison itself a character flaw, since some version of it is nearly universal. But the presence or absence of the delay still distinguishes, reliably, the people whose joy for you is immediate from the people whose joy requires a small, internal negotiation first. This distinction matters most in relationships where the words themselves would already sound perfect on paper. Congratulations offered generously, questions asked with apparent interest, since it is precisely in those cases that the timing becomes the only remaining evidence available, the content having been polished into something that could not, on its own, ever betray the beat that preceded it. Learning to notice the pause without becoming preoccupied by it takes some practice, since most people, once they start looking for it, briefly start seeing it everywhere, even in perfectly genuine reactions that simply took a fraction of a second longer for entirely unrelated reasons. Distraction, surprise, a moment of simply processing good news that arrived unexpectedly. Notice the faces that light up instantly at your good news and the faces that pause, and let the speed, more than the sincerity of the words that eventually follow, tell you something true. The way they apologize or do not, harm occurs, small or large, and what follows either takes the shape of a clear, specific, unconditional acknowledgement of what happened and its impact, or it takes some other shape entirely, a deflection, a qualifier that shifts the blame elsewhere, a vague gesture toward regret that carries no actual weight, or nothing at all. Silence standing in for an apology that never quite arrives. A genuine apology requires the apologizer to sit, briefly but really, in the discomfort of having caused harm, prioritizing your experience of that harm over their own comfort in admitting it. And the willingness to occupy that discomfort is itself a measure of how much your feelings actually weigh in the relationship's accounting. The vague or conditional apology, "I am sorry you feel that way. I am sorry if that upset you," is doing something different. Managing the situation rather than actually addressing the harm, the wording quietly protecting the apologizer's self-image at the cost of ever fully validating yours. The absent apology, offered by someone who has decided, consciously or not, that the harm does not require acknowledgement, is its own clear statement, the clearest available, about how much weight your pain has been assigned. This is worth examining in your own apologies too, since the language you reach for when you have caused someone else pain reveals the same thing about how much their feelings actually weigh in your own accounting. And noticing your own reflexive shift toward qualifiers, toward explanations that quietly excuse rather than acknowledge, can be an uncomfortable but genuinely useful mirror. There is also a meaningful difference between an apology offered immediately and one that only arrives after being explicitly demanded, since the first suggests genuine, spontaneous recognition of harm caused, while the second suggests compliance extracted under pressure rather than remorse that arrived on its own. Notice the quality of the apologies you have received across your life, and let the quality, more than the frequency, tell you how your pain has actually been held by the people offering them. How they treat you when they are tired. Exhaustion strips away the energy required to maintain a curated, managed version of the self, leaving behind whatever baseline actually exists underneath the performance. And that baseline, however unflattering or however reassuring, is closer to the truth of a relationship than almost any interaction that occurs when both people still have plenty of social energy left to spend. The person who remains kind when they are too tired to perform kindness is genuinely kind, the warmth surviving precisely because it was never dependent on the energy required to maintain a polished exterior in the first place. The person who becomes sharp, dismissive, or cold the moment their reserves run low is showing you what remains once the varnish has worn away. And the wood underneath, whatever its actual quality, is the material the relationship has been built from the entire time, however well the varnish usually disguised it. This is not a call to judge anyone by their single worst, most depleted moment, since everyone has bad days, but a pattern that appears reliably every time energy runs low is no longer a bad day. It is a baseline. And the baseline deserves more trust than the polished version that only ever appears when there is enough energy available to produce it. This is also worth applying gently to yourself, since the way you treat the people closest to you on your own most depleted, most exhausted days is quietly revealing your own actual baseline to them in exactly the same way. And a moment of honest, uncomfortable self-observation here often does considerably more for the health of a relationship than any amount of well-rested, carefully performed kindness offered only on the easier, less demanding days. Notice how people treat you at the end of a long, depleting day, when performing has become too expensive to sustain. And let that unmanaged version tell you what the well-rested, carefully maintained version has been quietly covering. The consistency that reveals the truth. A single warm gesture proves very little on its own, easily explained by a good mood, a lucky day, a moment of unusual generosity that may never repeat. But a pattern of warmth, sustained across weeks and months and difficult stretches alike, is an entirely different kind of evidence, since consistency is the signature of a genuine, underlying orientation rather than a passing circumstance. The person who is reliably warm, across good days and bad, across convenient moments and inconvenient ones, is revealing something structural about how they actually regard you, a default setting rather than a performance reserved for easy occasions. The person who is warm only occasionally, brilliant in flashes and cold or absent the rest of the time, is revealing something structural too, a warmth that gets deployed strategically rather than offered as a baseline. And the deploying, however genuine it feels in each individual instance, is not the same thing as consistency. What matters most is not any single peak of generosity, which represents only the best a person is capable of on their best day, but the average, the most repeated behavior across the widest range of circumstances, since the average is what you are actually going to live inside day to day, long after any particular peak has faded from memory. This can be an uncomfortable reframing for relationships that contain occasional, genuinely spectacular moments of generosity surrounded by long stretches of something considerably more ordinary or even neglectful. Since the spectacular moments tend to loom larger in memory precisely because they are memorable, while the ordinary stretches, being unremarkable, fade into a kind of background. You stop consciously registering even though it is the part you are actually living in most of the time. A single grand gesture can feel like proof of deep love while quietly obscuring a much larger body of evidence pointing elsewhere, which is exactly why the average, however unglamorous, deserves more trust than the peak. Notice the pattern rather than the exceptions in how people treat you, and let the most repeated version, not the most impressive one, be the version you actually trust. Whether they protect your name, somewhere, in a room you were not in, your name came up. And what happened next, whether it was defended, corrected, or quietly abandoned to whatever misrepresentation was circulating, is one of the deepest and least visible tests of loyalty available, precisely because it requires someone to spend social capital on your behalf, with no possibility of you ever finding out, unless someone else happens to mention it later. The person who corrects a misrepresentation, who refuses to add to gossip even when adding would have been easy and low cost, who speaks up for you when staying silent would have cost them nothing, is offering a loyalty that operates without an audience and without any expectation of gratitude, since you were never even meant to learn about it. The person who stays silent, who lets an unfair characterization pass without objection, who joins in rather than pushing back, is revealing that your reputation, in that particular room, was not worth whatever small social discomfort defending it would have required. This kind of protection is structural, rather than performed precisely because it happens where no performance could possibly be observed, which is exactly what makes it, when you do learn of it, one of the more trustworthy signals of genuine regard a person can offer. The reverse test is worth applying to yourself too, honestly, since your own willingness to defend someone's name in a room where defending it costs you something, a moment of social friction, an awkward disagreement with the group's general mood, is the exact same measure of your own loyalty that you are learning to read in others. And most people, examined honestly, discover the standard they hold others to is not always the standard they have consistently held themselves to in return. Notice, when word of it reaches you, whether your name was protected in rooms you never entered, and let that unwitnessed loyalty carry more weight than any promise of loyalty made directly to your face. The treatment that tells you everything this tier has traced, the introduction, the remembering, the unwitnessed effort, the response to struggle, the handling of a boundary, the inclusion or the forgetting, the reaction to success, the apology or its absence, the treatment during exhaustion, the consistency across time, the protection of your name in rooms you never entered, converges on a single, comprehensive truth that the most reliable account of what someone actually thinks of you is not contained in any single gesture or any single sentence, but in the accumulated pattern of how they treat you across every mood, every convenience and inconvenience, every public moment, and every private one where nobody was watching at all. This accumulated treatment does not lie the way a single performance can, because sustaining a contradiction between genuine feeling and consistent behavior across enough time and enough circumstances requires more effort than almost anyone is capable of maintaining indefinitely, which means the truth eventually surfaces in the pattern, even when it has been carefully concealed in any individual moment. None of this requires cataloging every interaction obsessively, Only a willingness to notice the pattern that has already been forming, quietly, the entire time you have known this person, whether or not you had previously thought to look at it as a single, continuous body of evidence. There is a real gentleness available in this framing too, since it means no single argument, no single disappointing evening, no single moment either of you would rather forget defines the relationship on its own. The true account being considerably larger and considerably more forgiving than any one difficult memory, provided the surrounding pattern genuinely earns that forgiveness through its own accumulated consistency. Notice how the people in your life have actually treated you, not in their best moment and not in their worst, but in the sum of every ordinary moment between the two. And let that sum, rather than any single memory, be the account you finally trust. The pupil that dilates for you. Somewhere behind the ordinary details of a conversation, a person's pupils have expanded slightly, a fraction of a millimeter, entirely beyond their own awareness or control, responding to something in you that their conscious mind has not yet finished evaluating. Pupil dilation answers to the autonomic nervous system rather than to deliberate intention, expanding in response to whatever the brain has flagged as interesting, appealing, or emotionally significant, which makes it one of the few physical signals a person cannot manufacture on command, no matter how much they might want to appear more engaged than they actually feel. Research on this particular signal has found something striking, that people rate faces with dilated pupils as more attractive, more trustworthy, and simply more likable, the observer's own brain reading the dilation as an unspoken invitation and responding to it with warmth. The observer could not fully explain if asked to justify it consciously. The pupil that opens wider in your presence is doing something involuntary and, in its own small way, quite intimate. A private physiological vote cast without the voter's permission, constricting instead for whatever the brain has decided does not deserve the same attention. This signal is genuinely difficult to observe deliberately, requiring closer and more sustained eye contact than most ordinary conversations naturally produce, which is part of why it tends to register only as a vague, unexplained warmth, rather than as a consciously identified fact, the brain absorbing the information long before language catches up to it. It helps to know what to compare against, since pupil size shifts constantly with ambient light, meaning the useful comparison is never one person's pupils in isolation, but the same person's pupils across different moments and different company, a baseline that reveals itself only with familiarity and patient, repeated observation, rather than a single passing glance across a dim room. Notice the eyes that seem to open for you specifically, and let that unspoken, involuntary widening stand as one of the more private forms of admiration a body can offer without a single word passing between you. The voice that changes around you. A familiar voice shifts, registers slightly the moment it turns toward you. Lower, softer, quicker, warmer. Some small adjustment the speaker almost certainly could not describe if you asked them directly, since the vocal muscles answer to emotional state well before they answer to conscious intention. Research on vocal behavior has found consistent patterns here. People unconsciously lowering their pitch when speaking to someone they are drawn to, speeding up when excited, slowing down when being careful, softening when feeling tender. Each shift produced by an emotional current running beneath the words, rather than by any decision made about how to sound. The voice that changes specifically and reliably around you, rather than staying constant across every person a speaker talks to, is doing something the words themselves rarely manage, offering a continuous, largely unmanaged commentary on how your presence is actually landing beneath whatever is technically being said. This is easiest to notice in recordings, oddly enough, since a live conversation gives you no comparison point, while hearing the same person's voice with you, and then with someone else, even in an unrelated recording, can reveal a shift you would never have caught happening in real time. The voice is, in this sense, one of the body's more musical instruments, too complex to fully script and too revealing to hide the feeling underneath it from anyone actually listening for the tune rather than only the lyrics. Phone calls make this particularly noticeable too, since a voice on the phone has no face or posture to lean on, only sound, which means the tone shift, when it happens, arrives with nowhere else to hide. The entire emotional message compressed into pitch and pace alone, more exposed on a call than it would ever be in person, where a dozen other channels would otherwise share the load of carrying it. Notice the voices that soften or quicken specifically around you, and let that shift, more than any single sentence, carry the deeper part of the message. The blush they cannot hide. Color rises to a face without permission, sudden and entirely visible, produced by the sympathetic nervous system flooding blood toward the skin in response to embarrassment, attraction, or the sudden, unwelcome awareness of being closely watched, and the person experiencing it would almost certainly stop it if they knew how, which they do not, because the blush answers to no deliberate command whatsoever. This particular signal cannot be faked and cannot be suppressed on demand, which places it among the more reliable physiological tells a body produces. An admission written directly onto the most visible part of a person's anatomy, available to anyone simply looking in that moment. The blush that appears specifically in your presence, rather than as a general tendency toward easy embarrassment, is telling you your presence itself produces a reaction the social mind was not prepared to display. Blood answering a feeling the face was actively trying to keep composed a moment earlier. What makes the blush particularly interesting as a signal is its democratic quality. Available to nearly everyone regardless of how otherwise composed or guarded a person tends to be, cutting straight through whatever careful management the rest of the face has been maintaining throughout the rest of the conversation. It is worth distinguishing this from the general tendency toward easy blushing that some people simply carry as part of their physiology, flushing readily at almost any attention regardless of who is offering it. Since the more meaningful signal is never whether a person blushes easily in general, but whether the blushing is specific to you, arriving reliably in your presence far more than it does around other people in otherwise comparable situations and comparably social settings. Notice the color that rises in someone's face around you, and let that involuntary, uneditable flush tell you something the calm, composed voice accompanying it was actively trying not to reveal. The nervous system that responds to you. A heartbeat quickens, palms grow faintly damp, a breath shortens, none of it announced, none of it chosen. Each one a small piece of a much larger physiological response a person's body is producing in your presence without ever consulting the conscious mind that would ordinarily like to manage such things. The nervous system does not clearly distinguish between attraction and anxiety in its initial reaction, both producing a similar acceleration, a similar heightened alertness, which means a person may register only that their body is doing something intense without immediately being able to name what that something actually is, the intensity itself being the honest report, even when its label remains unclear. A person whose body visibly activates in your presence is a person for whom you register as significant, neurologically, regardless of whether the significance eventually resolves into warmth, discomfort, or some mixture of the two. While a person whose nervous system stays entirely flat around you is a person for whom your presence is, in the most literal physiological sense, not currently registering as anything worth a reaction. This distinction matters because it separates two very different kinds of neutral: the calm produced by genuine comfort and ease, and the flatness produced by simple indifference. And learning to tell the two apart usually comes down to context. Whether the calm arrived gradually, over time, as trust built, or was present from the very first meeting, before any trust had the chance to develop at all. Over time and repeated meetings, the two tend to become easier to tell apart, since anxiety-driven activation usually settles as trust builds and familiarity grows, while attraction-driven activation often persists or even intensifies the more comfortable and familiar the relationship becomes. A divergence that only reveals itself with patience rather than in any single, isolated encounter. Notice the visible signs of activation in the people around you, the quickened breath, the shift in color, the restless hands, and let that activation tell you something. Words were never built to communicate directly. The jealousy they did not mean to show. Your attention turns briefly towards someone else. Nothing dramatic, an ordinary conversation across a room, and something flickers across a face nearby. A tightening, a stillness. A flash of something the person would almost certainly deny feeling if you asked them about it directly a moment later. This flicker is involuntary, a protective response firing before the conscious mind has had time to evaluate whether the threat it just registered is real or proportionate, the body reacting to a perceived risk to a connection the person values more than they had previously been willing to admit, even to themselves. The jealousy is, in this sense, a genuine tell. revealing a stake in your attention the person had not consciously declared, the involuntary flash announcing what the more careful, composed version of them had been keeping private, sometimes even from their own conscious awareness. It can appear in several small forms: a sudden quietness, a forced and visibly effortful indifference, a subtle change in posture that draws slightly closer or slightly more guarded, each one a leak from an emotional system. The social system is actively working to contain and mostly failing to contain completely. This is not always flattering to witness, since jealousy can arrive tangled with insecurity, possessiveness, or a fear of loss that has nothing admirable about it. And a flicker of jealousy is not, on its own, proof of a healthy or safe kind of caring. Only proof that a stake exists. The quality of that stake being an entirely separate question worth examining on its own terms, rather than treating every flash of jealousy as automatically romantic or reassuring. Notice the jealousy someone tries and fails to hide, and let the trying itself, more than the successful hiding, be read as the confession their mouth was never going to make on its own. The relief when you leave the room. Shoulders drop, breathing deepens, a face visibly settles the instant you exit a space. Small changes that would be entirely unremarkable on their own, except for their precise timing, arriving exactly at your departure rather than at any other point in the conversation, which is what makes the pattern worth noticing rather than dismissing as coincidence. This kind of release is involuntary, the body relaxing because whatever stimulus had been producing tension has just been removed, and the removing, experienced as relief, is an honest physiological report that your presence had required a level of management. The person's body is glad to finally set down. The relief does not necessarily mean dislike. Sometimes your presence simply requires effort, performance, a kind of vigilance that is genuinely tiring regardless of the underlying feeling, but the tiring itself is still information, telling you that being around you currently costs something. This particular person has been quietly paying without saying so. Watching for this pattern requires a certain willingness to notice something uncomfortable, since most people would rather not learn that their presence produces relief upon departure rather than warmth throughout. But the discomfort of the noticing does not make the pattern any less real or any less worth eventually addressing. It helps to hold this pattern gently rather than with any immediate alarm, since a single instance could reflect a bad day, an unrelated stress, or simple exhaustion that has nothing to do with you at all, but a relief that repeats consistently across many separate departures and many different moods becomes considerably harder to explain away as anything other than what it plainly appears to be. Notice whether the energy in a room settles or lifts once you have left it, and let that settling, difficult as it is to witness, tell you something the polite goodbye at the door did not. The excitement they try to contain. A face brightens the instant you appear, genuinely, visibly, and then, within a second or two, composes itself into something more measured, more socially appropriate. The sequence happening fast enough that most observers would miss the first half entirely and register only the more controlled second half as the whole of the reaction. This containing is itself the tell. A person whose social mind has decided the initial, genuine delight was too large or too revealing to display in full, and has intervened to bring the visible reaction down to a size the person feels comfortable letting you see. The person who tries to contain their excitement about you is, by definition, a person whose excitement is larger than their composure, the containing itself being evidence of a depth. The finished, managed expression was specifically designed to obscure from you. Watching for this requires attention to the very first half second of someone's reaction rather than the settled expression that follows, since the settled expression is the edited version, constructed after the fact, while the flash before it is the unedited original the editing was working to replace. This pattern tends to show up most reliably in relationships carrying some degree of social awkwardness or unspoken tension. A new acquaintance who is not yet sure how much warmth is appropriate to display. A person who has decided, for their own private reasons, to keep their feelings toward you more contained than they naturally would be. Both cases producing the same visible sequence. A genuine flash, followed by a hurried recalibration back toward something more measured and socially safe. Notice the faces that light up and then quickly settle when you arrive, and let that settling, the visible act of containment, tell you the truth. The calm expression was specifically built to hide. The contempt that flashes and disappears. Something crosses a face for a fraction of a second, one side of the mouth pulling faintly upward in a way that has nothing to do with humor, gone before you could name it, leaving behind an unease you cannot quite source, even though your perceiving mind clearly registered something. Contempt is the only genuinely asymmetric micro-expression, appearing on one side of the face rather than both. And that asymmetry, combined with its extreme brevity, makes it one of the hardest expressions to consciously catch and one of the most corrosive to actually receive, communicating not disagreement, but dismissal, not conflict, but a quiet, private ranking that places you beneath the person wearing it. Research by relationship researcher John Gottman identified contempt as the single strongest predictor of a relationship's failure. More predictive than anger, more predictive than open criticism. Precisely because contempt is not really about the specific disagreement at hand. It is about hierarchy. A message that the other person has decided, somewhere below conscious articulation, that you rank lower than they do. The flicker is gone almost as quickly as it arrives, but the residue tends to linger considerably longer. An unease that subsequent kindness rarely manages to fully dissolve. Because some part of the perceiving mind has already registered what it saw, and does not easily unregister it. Because it is so difficult to identify in the moment, contempt is also one of the easiest signals to gaslight yourself out of trusting. The rational mind insisting nothing was actually seen since nothing could be consciously described, but the residue it leaves behind is real information regardless of whether it can be named precisely. And dismissing that residue simply because you cannot produce a clear account of what caused it tends to be a mistake worth avoiding. Notice the flickers you have sensed without being able to name, and let the unease they left behind be trusted as more accurate than the composed expression that returned immediately afterward. The protectiveness that surprises them. Someone defends you with an intensity that visibly catches them off guard, their own voice rising faster and further than they seem to have intended, a surge of protection that arrives before conscious evaluation has had time to weigh whether the defending was actually warranted in that particular moment. This kind of automatic protectiveness fires ahead of deliberate decision, the body moving to shield you before the mind has finished considering whether shielding was the correct response, and the speed itself is the tell. Since a considered, deliberate defense looks and sounds quite different from one that simply erupted on its own. The surprise the person feels at their own intensity is, in a sense, a small act of self-revelation. The unconscious informing the conscious mind of something it had apparently known all along, that you matter to this person more than they had previously admitted, even to themselves. The mattering surfacing only because the moment made the surfacing unavoidable. This tends to show up most clearly during genuine conflict or crisis, when there is no time to compose a measured response, and whatever exists beneath the composure gets to act first, unfiltered and immediate. Watch, too, for how the person behaves in the immediate aftermath once the crisis has passed and the adrenaline has settled, since some people will visibly need a moment to process what just happened, almost startled by their own reaction, while others will move on as though nothing unusual occurred at all. And that aftermath, small as it seems, is its own quiet confirmation of just how genuinely surprising the surge was to the person who produced it. Notice the times someone has defended you with a force that seemed to surprise even them, and let that surprise be read as evidence of a regard running deeper than the person's own conscious awareness had previously acknowledged. The attention they cannot. Across a crowded room, someone's gaze keeps finding its way back to you, again and again, despite what looks like a genuine, repeated effort to focus elsewhere. The eyes returning the way a compass needle returns to north, regardless of how many times it gets nudged away from it. This kind of attention is involuntary because attention itself, genuine attention rather than its polite performance, is driven by an unconscious assessment of significance. The brain allocating its focus toward whatever it has already decided matters most. And that allocation, when you are the object of it, produces a pull. The conscious mind cannot fully override no matter how deliberately it tries to look somewhere more socially appropriate. What makes this signal especially reliable is the visible effort behind the failed redirection, since a person genuinely indifferent to you would not need to keep consciously steering their attention away from you in the first place. The repeated correcting being itself proof that something kept pulling their focus back before they noticed and adjusted again. This is a signal best read across an entire evening rather than any single glance, since one returning look could easily be coincidence, a face simply passing through your general direction while scanning a crowded room for something else entirely. but a gaze that returns to you specifically, again and again, far more often than a random scan across a room would statistically produce, is describing a pull that has very little to do with chance. There is also something worth noticing in how the person reacts once they realize they have been caught looking, since a quick, almost embarrassed break in eye contact tends to suggest the looking was not entirely intentional, an unmanaged pull. The person had not meant to reveal so plainly, while a steady, unashamed hold of your gaze once caught suggests something closer to a conscious decision rather than an involuntary drift. Notice the eyes that keep finding you across a room, despite an apparent effort to look elsewhere, and let that returning gaze tell you where the person's actual, unmanaged attention has decided to settle. The mirroring they do not know about. Beyond the ordinary matching of posture and gesture, a deeper form of mirroring runs beneath some relationships. Breathing that settles into a shared rhythm, a blink rate that begins to synchronize, an emotional tone that shifts to match yours without either person planning any of it consciously. Surface mirroring, the copying of posture, is common enough to be almost unremarkable, but respiratory mirroring runs deeper and rarer, and emotional mirroring, a mood adjusting itself to match another person's without any deliberate intention behind the adjusting, is rarer still. Each additional layer signaling a correspondingly deeper degree of unconscious connection between the two nervous systems involved. The depth of the mirroring a person offers you is, in effect, a measure of how much investment their unconscious mind has decided to make in synchronizing with yours. An investment that is never consciously authorized and therefore cannot be faked convincingly, no matter how much someone might want to appear closely attuned to you. Watching for this over an extended period, rather than a single conversation, tends to be more revealing, since the deepest layers of mirroring often only become visible once enough time has passed for two nervous systems to have settled into whatever rhythm they were naturally going to find with each other. This is worth noticing, especially in stressful or emotionally charged moments, since the depth of mirroring often becomes most visible precisely when it would be hardest to fake. A person whose own calm genuinely steadies alongside yours during a real crisis is offering something far more difficult to manufacture than a person whose posture simply happens to match yours during an easy, low-stakes conversation over coffee. Notice the person whose mood and rhythm seem to track yours most closely, and let that tracking, quiet and unplanned, be read as one of the unconscious mind's most generous, least performable forms of regard. The emotional contagion you produce. Your own mood moves into a room and, without a single word being exchanged about it, begins showing up in the faces and postures of the people around you. Your calm settling others, your anxiety unsettling them, your genuine joy lifting something in the room that nobody consciously decided to lift. Emotional contagion travels faster than conscious processing allows, transferring between people through nonverbal channels before either person could describe exactly what just happened. And the degree to which a particular person catches your emotional state is a measure of how permeable the boundary between your two systems has become, a permeability that tracks fairly reliably with genuine closeness. A person whose mood shifts easily in response to yours has a nervous system that has, in effect, opened itself to yours. The walls between the two systems lowered enough for the transfer to happen freely, while a person whose mood stays entirely unmoved, regardless of what you are visibly feeling, has kept those walls considerably higher, whether consciously or not. This is worth noticing in both directions, since your own susceptibility to catching other people's emotional states is telling you something about your own openness in return, an unconscious system running quietly in both parties at once, negotiating closeness without either person's explicit permission or awareness. This selectivity is exactly what makes emotional contagion worth trusting as a signal rather than dismissing as a universal reflex, since if everyone caught everyone else's moods equally, the phenomenon would tell you nothing meaningful about any particular relationship, but the fact that some people remain visibly unmoved by feelings that spread readily to others means the ones who do catch yours have granted your emotional state a kind of unconscious priority. Most people around you have not extended. Notice who seems to catch your feelings most readily, and let that catching, involuntary and selective, be read as one of the more intimate forms of connection two nervous systems are capable of producing together. The signals beyond their control. Everything this tier has traced, the widening pupil, the shifting voice, the involuntary blush, the activated nervous system, the flash of unwanted jealousy, the relief at your departure, the excitement quickly contained, the flicker of contempt, the protectiveness that surprised even the person offering it, the attention that would not redirect, the deep, unconscious mirroring, the emotional contagion running between two systems converges on a single recognition that the body's most honest reporting happens precisely where conscious management has the least reach, in the systems too fast, too automatic, or too deeply wired to be edited on demand. These signals are the body's editorial on a relationship, delivered continuously and almost entirely without the speaker's permission, and their unmanaged quality is exactly what makes them worth trusting more than any polished, carefully composed sentence a person could construct instead. None of this requires becoming clinically suspicious of every physical reaction you notice in someone. Most of these signals are subtle enough that only a pattern, repeated across time, deserves your full confidence. But that pattern, once you have learned to notice it, tends to tell you more than years of carefully chosen words ever fully managed to say. What makes this particular category of signal worth learning above almost any other is precisely its involuntary nature. Since a person who has decided to deceive you can, with enough effort, manage their words, their expression, even their posture for a while. But very few people can simultaneously manage their pupils, their pulse, their breath, and their blush, all at once, for the full length of an extended conversation, which means the longer you spend with someone, the more of these unmanageable signals eventually leak through regardless of intention. Notice the signals beyond anyone's control that have been running quietly around you your entire life, and let them stand as some of the most honest testimony a body has ever offered. Another body without either one saying a word. The question they never ask you. Weeks pass in an otherwise friendly relationship, and you notice, once you actually stop to notice it, that a particular person has never once asked how you are doing in any way that expected a real answer. Never asked about your plans, your worries, the things quietly occupying your mind, the conversation always circling back, gently but consistently, to them. Genuine interest in another person produces questions almost by reflex, the curious mind wanting to know more, unable to help itself from reaching for another detail, another layer. And the absence of that reflex is not simply a personality quirk, it is the absence of the curiosity itself, however warmly the rest of the interaction is otherwise conducted. This can be easy to miss precisely because the relationship might still feel pleasant in every other respect, warm tone, easy laughter, comfortable company, none of which requires the underlying curiosity that would actually produce a question about your inner life rather than your surface presence. The not asking, sustained, over months, becomes its own kind of answer. A quiet, repeated signal that says, without ever saying it directly, that your inner world has not become a place this person feels pulled to explore. A single missed question proves nothing. Everyone forgets to ask sometimes, distracted by their own circumstances. But a consistent, months-long pattern of never asking is a pattern deserving your honest attention, rather than continued explaining away. It is worth noticing, too, the quality of the questions when they do arrive, since a question that stays entirely surface level, "How was your weekend?" delivered the same way every single time with no follow-up ever attached to the answer, is doing considerably less work than a question that actually builds on what you said last time, remembering the thread and picking it back up, rather than starting fresh from nothing on each occasion. Notice who asks about you without needing to be prompted, and who does not, and let that quiet asking, or its absence, tell you something about the curiosity actually present underneath the friendliness. The compliment they never give. You accomplish something genuinely worth acknowledging, and a particular person, otherwise perfectly pleasant, says nothing about it at all. The silence arriving not from ignorance, since they clearly know, but from something else entirely, something withheld, rather than something simply absent. A withheld compliment carries a different texture than an oblivious one. A specific, faintly uncomfortable tension in the person's manner around the accomplishment they are visibly declining to name, as though acknowledging your quality out loud would cost them something they are not prepared to pay. This kind of withholding often traces back to competition, envy, or a complicated ambivalence the withholder has never fully examined in themselves, the awareness of your accomplishment present and functioning, the words simply blocked from ever making the trip from thought to speech. It differs meaningfully from genuine obliviousness, which produces a clean, uncomplicated absence with no accompanying tension, while withholding produces a visible strain, a moment where the compliment seems to almost surface and then gets swallowed before it fully arrives. Recognizing the difference matters because it changes what the silence is actually telling you. Oblivion says you were simply not on this person's radar in that moment, while withholding says you were very much on their radar and something in them decided, consciously or not, that naming your quality out loud was not something they were willing to do. This is worth separating gently from a person who simply expresses admiration differently, through action rather than words, offering practical support instead of verbal praise. Since the withholding worth taking seriously is the one accompanied by a genuine, visible flatness around the topic, rather than a person whose warmth was simply expressed through some other channel that happened to look less like a compliment on the surface. Notice the compliments that seem to almost arrive and then do not, and let that visible strain tell you the accomplishment was seen, even though it was never actually said. The call they never make first. Across months, you notice a consistent asymmetry. You are always the one reaching out, suggesting the coffee, sending the first message after a stretch of silence, while the other side of the relationship waits, reliably, for you to make the first move every single time. A person who never initiates is not necessarily someone who does not care. Some people are simply passive by temperament, comfortable letting others drive the logistics of a friendship. But the pattern still carries real information regardless of the explanation behind it. Since a relationship sustained entirely by your effort is a relationship in which you occupy the active role and the other person occupies the passive one, whatever the reason for that arrangement happens to be. The clearest way to see this pattern honestly is to imagine, briefly and without acting on it, what would happen if you simply stopped initiating altogether. Since the imagined result, silence stretching indefinitely, or a reaching that eventually comes on its own, tells you something true about where the relationship's actual momentum has been coming from, the entire time. This is not necessarily a verdict on how much someone likes you, since passivity and affection can coexist, but it is a verdict on the relationship's actual architecture, who has been carrying the weight of keeping it alive, while the other person simply receives the benefit of a connection they are not equally investing in maintaining. There is a fair complication worth naming here too, since some people carry a genuine anxiety around initiating contact, a fear of being a burden, or of reaching out at the wrong moment, and that anxiety can produce the exact same passive pattern as simple indifference, while meaning something entirely different underneath it, which is why the pattern is worth discussing directly with someone you actually trust, before quietly concluding the worst explanation on your own. Notice who reaches for you and who waits to be reached for, and let that pattern tell you something honest about where the relationship's actual effort has been living. The curiosity they do not have. A conversation moves along pleasantly enough, and yet something about it feels oddly flat. And eventually you realize why. The other person is not actually curious about you, asking nothing that opens a new thread, following no detail further than its surface, content to let the conversation stay exactly as shallow as it started without ever reaching for more. Genuine curiosity about another person is close to insatiable in the people who actually carry it, wanting to understand deeper, to discover further, the wanting itself functioning as the engine that keeps a relationship developing rather than simply repeating the same surface exchanges indefinitely. The absence of that engine produces a relationship maintained by habit, obligation, or simple convenience rather than by any active desire to keep learning who you actually are. And a relationship running on habit alone tends to feel, over time, considerably thinner than one still being actively fed by ongoing curiosity. This absence is rarely announced directly. Nobody says, "I am not curious about you." It simply shows up as a slow accumulation of unasked follow-up questions, unexplored details, threads offered and left untouched, until the pattern becomes unmistakable in hindsight, even though no single moment made it obvious. This is easiest to sense in the moment right after you share something genuinely new about yourself, watching whether the other person's next question actually builds on what you just revealed or simply moves the conversation somewhere else entirely, since the building is where real curiosity shows itself most plainly, an eagerness to keep pulling on a thread rather than letting it drop the instant it has been offered. Notice the people who are curious about you and the people who are not, and let that curiosity, or its absence, tell you whether the relationship is still actively growing or has simply settled into its current shape. The detail they never notice. Something about you has visibly changed. A different haircut, a shift in mood you have been carrying for days, weight lost or gained, and a particular person moves through an entire conversation without registering any of it. Not because the change was subtle, but because their attention was never actually pointed closely enough at you to catch it in the first place. Noticing requires attention, and attention requires interest, and interest requires some baseline of regard, which means the chain from detail to noticing is not really about observational skill. It is about where a person's focus has been trained to land, and a person whose focus reliably lands on you will catch the small shifts almost without trying. The person who never notices is not necessarily unkind. Some people are simply less visually or emotionally attentive by nature across the board, but the specific pattern of never noticing you, contrasted against noticing other things quite readily, tells you something more precise, that their particular attention has not been trained toward you the way it has toward other areas of their life. This becomes especially telling when the change was significant enough that a stranger might have caught it, since a genuinely close person walking past an obvious transformation without registering it at all is revealing an inattention that casual passersby, ironically, sometimes do not share. It is worth being fair to the general limits of human attention here too, since nobody catches every single change in every single person around them. But the useful comparison is not against some impossible standard of perfect observation. It is against how reliably that same person catches changes in other people they clearly do prioritize. A comparison that tends to reveal, fairly quickly, whether the inattention is general or specific to you. Notice who catches the small, easily missed changes in you, and who walks past a transformation without seeing it. And let that noticing, or its absence, measure the attention actually being paid. The help they never offer. A need arises, visible enough that anyone paying attention would catch it, and a particular person, present the entire time, simply does not move toward it, offering neither the help itself nor even an acknowledgement that help might be wanted. The need passing by entirely unaddressed, while life continues around it as though nothing had happened. A person who genuinely holds you in real regard tends not to wait passively to be asked. They notice the need and they move. The moving being produced by attention, and the attention being produced in turn by care. A chain that starts with noticing and ends in action without much conscious deliberation required in between. The person who never offers is failing somewhere along that chain. Either they are not seeing the need at all, which is its own failure of attention, or they are seeing it clearly and simply not moving, which is a more direct failure of regard. And either version tells you something real about where you currently sit in this person's ongoing hierarchy of concern. This becomes most visible in comparison, watching how readily the same person offers help to someone else entirely, a different friend, a family member. Since the contrast reveals whether the withholding is a general trait or something specific to how they have decided to relate to you in particular. There is also a version of this worth naming honestly. The person who genuinely would help if asked directly but never seems to notice on their own, which is a real and meaningful difference from the person who declines even after being asked plainly. Since the first describes a gap in observation, while the second describes something considerably closer to an actual unwillingness, once the need has been made completely unmistakable. Notice who sees your need before you have to name it and who requires you to ask directly, even after the need has become obvious, and let that difference tell you more about their regard than any words offered around it. The sacrifice they never make. Every relationship eventually asks something of the people inside it. Time given up, comfort set aside, an inconvenience absorbed on someone else's behalf, and the willingness to actually pay that cost when it arrives reveals the real depth of a person's regard with a precision that warm words offered on easy days never quite manage to match. The person who will rearrange their schedule, endure real discomfort, or set aside their own preference for your sake is demonstrating that their regard is deep enough to motivate an actual cost, not merely deep enough to produce pleasant company when nothing difficult is being asked of them. The person who reaches a specific point, a specific size of inconvenience, and simply will not go further, is revealing the ceiling of their regard, a limit that stays invisible during the easy stretches of a relationship and becomes suddenly, unmistakably visible. The one time a real cost is actually required. This is not a call to test people constantly or to keep a running ledger of who has sacrificed what, since that kind of accounting corrodes a relationship on its own, but it is worth honestly noticing. Without manufacturing the test artificially, what happens the naturally occurring times? A real sacrifice was actually asked for. This is also worth noticing about yourself with equal honesty. Since the sacrifices you are and are not willing to make for the people in your own life are drawing the exact same kind of map about your own regard. A map that is often easier to see clearly in others than in your own quietly negotiated limits. Notice the sacrifices people have made for you across your life and the ones they quietly decline to make. And let that boundary, wherever it sits, be the most accurate map available of how deep the regard actually runs. The space they never make for you. A life fills up with obligations the way any life does, and somewhere in the middle of that fullness, certain people manage, consistently, to carve out room for you anyway, adjusting a schedule, protecting an evening, prioritizing your presence over some other perfectly reasonable claim on their time, while other people, technically fond of you, never quite seem to find the room, no matter how much time appears to pass. Space is not simply given by a life that happens to have some left over, it is actively made, carved deliberately out of a schedule that is already full for everyone. And the carving requires motivation, and the motivation requires a genuine prioritizing of you over whatever else was also asking for that same slot of time. The person who never makes space is not necessarily busier than the person who does. Busyness is close to universal. But their particular allocation of the busyness they do have has simply not routed itself toward you with any real consistency. And that routing, or its absence, is the actual signal worth reading, rather than the general claim of being busy. This becomes clearest across a long enough stretch of time, since any single missed occasion is easily explained by genuine circumstance. But a pattern of never quite finding room across months and years starts to describe a choice rather than a coincidence. There is a specific kind of clarity available in watching what happens when two competing claims on someone's time arrive at once, since the choice made in that exact moment of genuine competition, rather than in any hypothetical statement about priorities, tends to be the most honest evidence available of how the actual allocation is really being decided beneath whatever is said out loud about it. Notice who makes room for you in an already full life, and who never quite manages to, and let that room, or its absence, be the most practical measure available of where you actually rank. The fight they never have with you. Disagreements arise in every relationship eventually, and the person who engages with yours, who pushes back, who invests real emotional energy into working through friction rather than simply letting it slide past unaddressed, is demonstrating something counterintuitive but genuinely important, that the relationship matters enough to fight for. The person who never fights, who lets every potential conflict dissolve into silence or avoidance, is not necessarily peaceful in any meaningful sense. They may simply be indifferent, the absence of conflict reflecting an absence of investment rather than an abundance of harmony. Since fighting requires energy, and energy requires motivation, and motivation requires genuine regard for the outcome. This is one of the more counterintuitive signs in this entire hour precisely because conflict is usually experienced as unpleasant, something to be minimized rather than welcomed, which makes it easy to mistake a relationship's total absence of friction for health, when it may actually reflect one person having quietly decided the relationship is not worth the emotional cost of engaging with its problems directly. The distinction worth drawing here is between fighting that stays respectful, aimed at actually resolving something, and fighting that is simply cruel or destructive, since only the first kind reflects genuine investment, the second kind reflecting something considerably less healthy, regardless of how much energy it appears to contain. It is worth watching, too, for what happens after a disagreement is actually resolved, since a person genuinely invested tends to return afterward warmer and more settled, the friction having actually cleared something, while a person who fought only reluctantly, or who fights in ways aimed at winning rather than resolving, tends to carry a residual coolness forward that the argument never fully managed to dissolve. Notice who engages with the friction in your relationship and who lets everything dissolve into silence instead, and let that engagement, uncomfortable as it sometimes is, be read as a form of investment rather than dismissed as simple difficulty. The effort that is always missing. A pattern settles in over time. Not dramatic, not a single obvious slight, simply a consistent, quiet minimum, the least effort technically required to maintain the relationship's basic function. Nothing extra ever added, no surplus warmth, no unprompted generosity. The relationship running permanently on the smallest sustainable budget, rather than on anything resembling abundance. This missing effort is not laziness in any general sense, since the same person is often perfectly capable of real effort elsewhere, in their career, their other relationships, their personal projects, which means the minimum being offered to you specifically is a choice about allocation rather than a general character trait, revealing where you actually rank among their competing priorities. The person who always gives the least sustainable amount is a person for whom you occupy a correspondingly modest position in their accounting. The minimum itself functioning as an honest, if unflattering, report on where the relationship currently sits relative to everything else claiming their limited effort and attention. This is worth distinguishing from a temporary dip during a genuinely difficult season. Everyone's capacity shrinks sometimes, but a sustained, long-term pattern of minimum effort, present across both easy times and hard ones, describes something closer to a permanent allocation than a passing circumstance. It is worth noticing, too, whether the minimum ever expands naturally when circumstances genuinely make more possible. A person suddenly free of a demanding project or a busy season, since a relationship that stays permanently at its floor, even once the surrounding constraints have lifted, is telling you something considerably more specific than one that was simply squeezed temporarily by external pressure. Notice the effort that consistently arrives at the bare minimum required and never any further. And let that consistent floor, rather than any single warm exception, tell you the actual priority you have been assigned. The emotion they never show you. Certain feelings simply never surface in front of you. Not anger, not grief, not need, not real vulnerability of any kind. The person maintaining a consistently composed, managed presence regardless of what might actually be happening beneath it. And that consistent withholding, sustained across the whole relationship, is itself a form of communication, however quiet. The emotions a person allows you to witness are the emotions they have judged safe to display, and the ones they never show. You are the ones they have judged unsafe, the judging being an assessment of whether this particular relationship can actually hold that particular vulnerability without something going wrong as a result. A person who never cries in front of you, never expresses genuine need, never lets you see real anger, is telling you, through the consistent absence, that the relationship has not yet earned enough trust to receive the fuller, less composed version of who they actually are. This withholding is rarely a conscious calculation made in any single moment. It operates more like a standing policy. The person is not even actively aware of maintaining, revealed only by its consistency across enough different situations that might otherwise have been expected to produce some crack in the composure. This is worth reading gently, rather than as a personal failure on your part, since the standing policy usually traces back to something in the other person's own history. A place where vulnerability once went badly and was never safely repaired, rather than to anything you have specifically done wrong in this particular relationship. Notice the emotions certain people never show you, despite plenty of opportunity. And let that consistent absence tell you something honest about how much of themselves they have decided this particular relationship can actually hold. The future they never mention you in. Someone talks about where their life is heading, plans forming naturally in conversation, and somewhere in that forward-looking talk, your name simply never comes up. Not once, not even in passing. The future being described as though it will unfold without your continued presence in it. A small, easy-to-miss absence that becomes considerably harder to miss once you notice how consistently it repeats. The way a person talks about their future is rarely a deliberate plan. It is closer to a projection, the imagination running forward and automatically populating the picture with whoever it considers a permanent fixture. And the populating, because it happens without conscious effort, reveals who that imagination actually includes, rather than who it has been told to include out of politeness. A person who talks about their future without you is not necessarily planning to leave you behind on purpose. The omission is usually simply automatic, but automatic is exactly what makes it worth noticing. An unforced signal about what their mind currently assumes, rather than a calculated statement of intent. This is worth listening for gently over time, rather than treating any single conversation as decisive, since the absence needs to repeat consistently across many separate moments before it becomes a genuinely reliable pattern rather than a simple, forgettable oversight in one particular conversation. There is a useful counter-test worth applying too, gently, noticing how naturally you yourself picture this particular person in your own future plans. Since the comparison between the two directions, how automatically they include you and how automatically you include them, often reveals a great deal about whether the imbalance, if one exists, runs in only one direction or is actually more mutual than it first appeared. Notice how people talk about their future and whether you appear in it without needing to be inserted. And let that automatic inclusion, or its absence, tell you something honest about the intention actually being held. The absence that tells you everything. Everything this tier has traced. The question never asked, the compliment never given, the call never made first, the curiosity absent, the detail never noticed, the help never offered, the sacrifice never made, the space never carved out, the fight never had, the effort permanently at its minimum, the emotion never shown, the future never mentioning you, converges on a single, quiet truth, that what people do not do is often more honest than what they do. Because what they do can be performed, managed, staged for an occasion, while what they consistently fail to do simply reveals the shape of a limit that no performance was built to cover in the first place. Absence is not nothing. It is negative space, defining a shape the way silence between notes defines the actual music, and reading that negative space carefully, rather than only counting the positive gestures that did arrive, gives you a considerably more complete account of any relationship than counting the gestures alone ever could. None of this requires treating every gap as evidence of something sinister. Plenty of absences have simple, harmless explanations, but a consistent, repeated pattern of absence across many separate categories deserves the same honest attention you would naturally give to a consistent, repeated pattern of presence. None of this is meant to produce a suspicious audit of every relationship in your life. Most absences have simple, forgivable explanations. But a genuinely repeated pattern across several of these 12 categories at once, rather than a single isolated gap, is worth taking seriously as a coherent signal, rather than dismissing piece by piece as unrelated coincidence. Notice everything a particular person has never quite gotten around to doing for you, and let that accumulated absence, gently but honestly, tell you something. The accumulated presence has perhaps been quietly overshadowing. What they do in a crisis reveals all. A genuine emergency strips away every luxury of preparation, every carefully composed response, leaving only the raw, unrehearsed behavior a person produces when there is no time left to construct the version they would rather show you. And that unrehearsed response, however brief the crisis itself turns out to be, is closer to the truth of a person's character than years of comfortable managed interaction could ever fully reveal on their own. The person who moves toward you in the middle of real danger, instinctively, before conscious deliberation has time to intervene, is revealing a deep, structural orientation toward your protection that no amount of polite conversation could have proven in advance. The person who moves away, who freezes, who becomes suddenly focused on their own safety first, is revealing something equally real, whether or not it reflects poorly on them as a person overall, since fear operates below the level most people can consciously override in the actual moment it strikes. What makes a crisis response so valuable as information is precisely its speed, since a genuinely composed, deliberate answer to who matters most requires time. The crisis never grants, forcing whatever exists beneath the performance to act first, unfiltered and immediate, before the more careful, socially calibrated self has any chance to intervene and edit the result. It is worth being fair here too, since not every freeze reflects a lack of care. Some people are simply wired toward a different survival response entirely, and a single frozen moment during one specific crisis does not necessarily overwrite years of otherwise consistent devotion, though a repeated pattern across several separate emergencies deserves considerably more weight than any single instance taken in isolation. Notice what the people in your life have done during the real emergencies you have shared with them, and let that unrehearsed evidence outweigh even years of comfortable, uneventful company. How they handle your vulnerability. You share something genuinely tender, a fear, a failure, a piece of yourself you do not offer casually, and the response that follows either receives that offering with real gentleness or handles it clumsily, dismissively, or worse, later uses it against you in some form. And that single response tells you more about the relationship's actual safety than months of pleasant, surface-level interaction ever managed to establish. A person who receives your vulnerability well does not flinch, does not rush to fix or minimize, does not change the subject the moment the conversation becomes genuinely uncomfortable, holding what you shared as something entrusted, rather than something to be immediately managed or resolved. A person who handles it poorly, growing visibly uneasy, offering a quick platitude and moving on, or, worst of all, repeating what you shared to someone else without your permission, is demonstrating that your vulnerability was received as a burden or a tool rather than as the gift of trust it actually was. This particular test can only be administered by the real thing, actual vulnerability, which is part of why it reveals so much, since a relationship's true capacity to hold your full self cannot be assessed from the outside, only discovered through the risk of the sharing itself. This is worth approaching carefully, rather than as a deliberate test, since manufacturing vulnerability, purely to see how someone reacts, tends to corrupt the very thing being measured. But when real vulnerability does arise naturally, as it eventually does in any relationship given enough time, the handling it receives is genuinely worth paying close, honest attention to. Notice what happened the last time you were genuinely vulnerable with someone, and let that handling, gentle or careless, tell you far more about the relationship's real depth than any amount of comfortable, guarded conversation ever could. The way they talk about you to others. A version of you exists in someone's mind that operates independently of your actual presence, built from the details they have chosen to notice, the tone they have decided to use, the emphasis they place when your name comes up in conversations you were never part of. And that independent version, because it exists whether or not you are there to shape it, is often more honest than anything the person would say directly to your face. Someone who describes you with warmth, specificity, and evident admiration to other people is carrying an internal portrait built from real, careful attention, while someone who describes you vaguely or attaches a subtle qualifier that never shows up in their direct praise is carrying a considerably thinner, more conditional portrait than the one you receive when you are actually present in the room together. You will rarely hear these descriptions directly. Most of what you learn arrives secondhand, through an overheard comment or a friend's careless slip. And the discomfort of learning it this way does not make the information any less valuable, since a person's unmanaged description of you, offered when you were never meant to hear it, sits considerably closer to their private truth than their carefully composed speech in front of you ever could. It is worth resisting the urge to actively hunt for this information, since deliberately seeking out how you are discussed behind your back tends to produce more anxiety than clarity. But when it arrives naturally, unforced, through an honest slip or an overheard remark, there is real value in letting it inform your understanding, rather than dismissing it simply because it arrived by accident, rather than by invitation. Notice what you have learned, however indirectly, about how someone speaks of you when you are not there to influence it, and let that unguarded account carry real weight alongside whatever warmth you receive directly. What they do when you cannot see. Behavior produced with no audience present, no social reward available, nothing to gain from performing any particular version of themselves, is behavior closer to a person's actual baseline than anything you witness while they know they are being observed, since an unwatched moment has no reason to be anything other than exactly what it is. The person who remains kind, careful, and considerate, even when they believe no one is watching, is kind at the level of default operation rather than performance, the kindness surviving precisely because it was never dependent on an audience to sustain it. The person who becomes careless, dismissive, or unkind the moment they believe observation has ended is revealing that the warmth you usually receive was, at least partly, produced for your benefit specifically, a performance rather than a genuine baseline. And the gap between the two versions is itself worth taking seriously as real information about which version is closer to the truth. This kind of evidence rarely arrives by design. It usually surfaces by accident, a moment glimpsed unintentionally, a story told by someone who witnessed the unwatched version without meaning to reveal anything. And the accidental nature of the discovery is exactly what makes it trustworthy, an unrehearsed glimpse behind a curtain nobody meant to leave open. This is also worth considering in reverse. Gently, about your own behavior, since the version of yourself that shows up when you believe no one is watching is the same honest test being applied to the people around you. And most people, examined truthfully, find at least some gap between their public performance and their private, unwatched default. Notice the behavior you have witnessed when someone did not know they were being watched, and let that unmanaged version tell you something the performed version was specifically built to obscure. The difference between duty and desire. Two people can perform an identical action for you, the same favor, the same gesture of care, and yet the action can feel entirely different depending on whether it arrived from genuine want or from a felt obligation. A difference invisible in the action itself, but almost always detectable in the energy that accompanies it. The lightness of desire against the quiet weight of should. A person acting from duty tends to do the right thing while carrying something heavier underneath it. A faint reluctance, a slight resentment the doing cannot quite conceal no matter how competently the gesture is technically performed. The obligation itself functioning like a tax. The person is paying rather than a gift they are offering. A person acting from genuine desire tends to bring a surplus of energy to the same action, an eagerness that generates rather than depletes them. The doing arising from want rather than requirement, and that surplus, subtle as it is, tends to register in the body of the person receiving it, even when the words and the actions themselves are identical on paper. Learning to feel this difference, rather than only observe the action, changes how much comfort you can honestly take from any given gesture. Since the same kindness performed from two different sources leaves two entirely different feelings behind once it is finished. There is a particular kindness in remembering that duty is not worthless. Plenty of relationships are sustained through difficult seasons by exactly this kind of committed obligation, and a person acting from duty during your hardest stretch is still choosing to show up rather than to leave, which counts for something real, even while it feels different from desire, in the moment it is actually being offered. Notice the things people do for you and whether the doing carries the lightness of desire or the quiet weight of obligation, and let that felt difference, not the action's surface content, guide how much you actually trust it. The person they become when you cry. Tears strip away the social convention that governs most ordinary interaction, demanding a response that arrives from somewhere considerably deeper than polite habit, and the specific person who shows up in that moment, softening toward you or hardening away, offering presence or offering only management, reveals a layer of character that comfortable, dry-eyed conversation rarely has occasion to expose. The person who moves closer when you cry, who offers presence rather than an immediate rush toward fixing, who can simply sit with your pain without needing it to stop quickly for their own comfort, is demonstrating that their deepest response to your distress is genuine connection rather than discomfort management. The person who grows visibly uneasy, who reaches immediately for solutions rather than simply staying present, who seems to want the crying to end more than they want to actually understand what produced it, is revealing that your pain activates their own discomfort first, the response oriented toward relieving that discomfort rather than toward truly being with you inside it. Neither response necessarily reflects a lack of love. Sometimes people were simply never taught how to sit with someone else's pain without trying immediately to solve it. But the response itself, regardless of its origin, still tells you something real about what actually happens in you when your guard finally comes down completely. It is also worth watching what happens after the crying has finished, since a person genuinely comfortable with your pain tends to let the moment close naturally without needing to reference it awkwardly afterward, while a person who found it genuinely difficult often signals that discomfort through a slightly stiff return to normal conversation, a subtle relief that the moment has finally passed and things can go back to being easier again. Notice who becomes when you cry in front of them, and let that revealed version, rather than any composed, comfortable conversation, tell you more about who they actually are underneath. How they act in hard times. Difficulty in a relationship functions like a fire that burns away everything, not structural, leaving behind only the actual foundation the relationship was built on. A foundation. The easy, comfortable stretches were never required to reveal, because nothing had yet demanded enough of either person to expose it clearly. The person who stays present when things become genuinely hard, who continues engaging, working through the difficulty rather than retreating from it, is demonstrating a regard built into the actual architecture of who they are, rather than applied as a pleasant surface that only functions under favorable conditions. The person who withdraws, who lets distance grow rather than working to close it, who becomes harder to reach exactly when reaching matters most, is revealing that their regard was, at least in part, dependent on the relationship remaining easy. A dependency the difficulty has now exposed, rather than created out of nothing. This is not a call to manufacture difficulty deliberately just to test someone, but when genuine hardship does arrive, as it eventually does in every relationship worth having, the response it produces deserves to be read honestly, rather than explained away for the sake of comfort. This distinction becomes clearest in hindsight, looking back at the specific relationships that survived a genuinely hard stretch intact and comparing them honestly against the ones that quietly dissolved the moment things stopped being easy. A comparison that tends to teach more about who actually holds structural regard for you than any number of pleasant, uneventful years ever could on their own. It also helps to separate the difficulty that originates outside the relationship, an illness, a job loss, a family crisis, from difficulty that originates inside it, a disagreement, a disappointment, a genuine hurt, since the two test entirely different capacities, one measuring loyalty under external pressure and the other measuring whether the relationship itself can survive friction generated between the two people directly. And a person who stays through the first but flees the second is telling you something quite specific about where their limits actually sit. Notice how people in your life respond when things actually become difficult, and let that response, rather than the ease of the good times, reveal the foundation the relationship was actually resting on all along. What they remember about you. Certain details about you surface in someone's memory without effort, unprompted, months or years after you mentioned them once in passing. Small facts that most people would have discarded immediately, but that this particular person retained anyway. A retention that is rarely conscious and therefore rarely faked. The brain simply deciding, without asking permission, that this piece of you was worth the cost of storage. The person who recalls the name of a childhood pet you mentioned once, the specific fear you named in an offhand comment, the small preference you never repeated, is a person whose attention classified you as significant enough to keep, and the classifying, done automatically and below conscious control, is one of the more trustworthy signals of regard available precisely because it cannot be manufactured on demand. This becomes especially meaningful when the detail in question was genuinely small, easily lost among the 1,000 other things a person hears in an ordinary week. Since the survival of something that unremarkable through months of accumulated new information says considerably more than the retention of something obviously important that anyone would have kept regardless. This is worth testing gently over time rather than judging from a single encouraging moment, mentioning something small yourself on separate occasions and simply noticing, honestly, whether it tends to resurface later unprompted, since the pattern across many small tests reveals far more than the surprising accuracy of any single remembered detail taken entirely on its own. It is worth adding that attention of this kind tends to be selective rather than uniform, most people retaining almost nothing about most of the people they meet, which means the presence of even one or two of these small, unforced memories about you specifically already sets that particular attention apart from the ordinary, forgettable baseline most passing acquaintances receive without a second thought. Notice the small, easily forgettable details someone carries about you without effort, and let that quiet, involuntary retention stand as one of the more honest, unmanufactured forms of regard a person's memory is capable of offering. The forgiveness they give or withhold. Harm occurs between two people, and what follows, genuine release or quiet, ongoing accounting, tells you something about how much grace this particular relationship has decided to extend you. Because forgiveness requires the injured person to absorb a real cost, the cost of what happened, and to choose deliberately not to convert that cost into leverage held for later use. A person who forgives genuinely lets the ledger close, does not bring the offense back up during unrelated future arguments, does not quietly hold it as a debt to be repaid at some convenient future moment. The releasing reflecting a regard for the relationship that outweighs the injury it absorbed. A person who forgives only partially, who says the words but keeps the offense available for future reference, has not actually forgiven so much as negotiated a temporary truce, converting the harm into a resource rather than genuinely absorbing its cost. And the difference between the two tends to become clear only over time, once you observe whether the old offense quietly resurfaces during later, unrelated conflicts. A person who does not forgive at all is communicating something equally real, that the harm exceeded whatever value the relationship currently holds for them, the cost simply too high for the regard available to cover it. There is also a version of this worth examining honestly in yourself. The offenses you claim to have forgiven that still quietly surface whenever a new argument arrives. Since noticing your own incomplete forgiveness offered to someone else is often the clearest possible way to understand exactly what genuine, complete forgiveness actually costs to give. Notice the forgiveness you have received across your relationships and the forgiveness that never quite arrived, and let each version tell you the true measure of your worth in that particular accounting. Whether they grow or resist with you, people change, sometimes gradually and sometimes suddenly, and the way someone responds to your own changing, welcoming it with genuine curiosity, or resisting it with visible discomfort, tells you whether their regard is actually attached to you as a living, developing person, or to a fixed, static version of you they have grown comfortable with and would prefer you did not outgrow. A person who celebrates your growth, who stays curious about who you are becoming rather than clinging to who you used to be, is demonstrating a regard flexible enough to hold an evolving relationship rather than one that requires you to remain permanently unchanged in order to keep receiving their affection. A person who resists your growth, who expresses discomfort or subtle disapproval at the changes, who seems to prefer the earlier version they had already adjusted to and understood, is revealing that their regard was extended to a specific version of you rather than to the whole, ongoing developing person you actually are. And that version, once it changes, may quietly take the regard along with it. This distinction becomes especially visible during periods of real personal transformation, a new direction, a recovered piece of yourself, since those are exactly the moments a relationship's actual flexibility, or its actual rigidity, finally becomes impossible to ignore. This is worth extending to yourself too, honestly, noticing whether you have room for the people in your own life to keep changing, or whether you have quietly grown attached to an earlier version of someone that no longer entirely matches who they have since become. Notice who grows alongside you and who seems to want you to stay exactly as you were, and let that difference tell you whether you are loved for who you are or merely for who you used to be. The way they say goodbye. A conversation ends, and the manner of the ending, warm and lingering or quick and relieved, carries its own honest report on how the interaction actually felt to the person leaving, since the goodbye is the moment the social performance finally gets to release. The investment a person makes in that final moment reflecting what the interaction actually cost or gave them, rather than what they were obligated to display throughout its middle. A person who says goodbye with warmth, who seems reluctant to actually end the contact, who lingers a beat longer than strictly necessary, is experiencing your departure as a small loss, the warmth surviving all the way to the very end, rather than dropping the instant the social obligation of politeness has been technically satisfied. A person who says goodbye quickly, with visible and unmistakable relief, is communicating that the interaction, whatever pleasant things were said during it, was ultimately experienced as something closer to a cost than a pleasure, the quick exit being the truest signal available about what the entire exchange actually meant to them. This is easiest to notice across repeated goodbyes with the same person, rather than in any single instance, since a single quick exit could reflect nothing more than an unrelated time pressure, but a pattern that repeats reliably. Goodbye after goodbye, across many separate occasions, begins to describe something considerably more consistent about how the person actually experiences their time with you. The manner of a goodbye also tends to leak forward, quietly shaping the anticipation of the next meeting, since a lingering, reluctant farewell plants a small, warm expectation for the reunion still to come, while a quick, relieved exit plants something closer to indifference about whether the next occasion happens at all. And noticing which of these two feelings tends to follow a particular person's goodbyes often confirms what the goodbye itself already suggested. Notice how people say goodbye to you across different relationships, and let that final, unguarded moment, more honest than almost anything said during the conversation itself, tell you what the time together genuinely meant. The deepest signs cannot be faked. Everything this tier has traced, the crisis response, the handling of vulnerability, the talk that happens in your absence, the behavior produced when unwatched, the difference between duty and desire, the person revealed by your tears, the response to genuine difficulty, the details effortlessly remembered, the forgiveness offered or withheld, the welcome or resistance toward your growth, the quality of every goodbye, converges on a single, quiet truth, that the deepest, most reliable evidence of what someone actually thinks of you comes from precisely the moments where conscious management has the least time or ability to intervene. The character beneath the performance, finally getting the chance to act on its own. These deeper signs matter more than any surface-level warmth, because sustaining a contradiction between genuine feeling and consistent tested behavior requires more effort than almost anyone can maintain indefinitely, especially across the specific, high-pressure moments this tier has named. which means the truth eventually surfaces there, even when it has stayed carefully hidden everywhere else. None of this diminishes the value of ordinary, comfortable warmth. Most of a relationship is lived in exactly those easy, low-pressure conditions. But when you need the clearest possible read on where you actually stand, it is these tested, pressured moments, rather than the pleasant everyday ones, that carry the final, most reliable word. Taken together, these 11 pressured moments form something closer to a composite portrait than any single one could offer alone, and a person who scores well across most of them, even while faltering occasionally in one or two, is still demonstrating a regard considerably more substantial than a person whose warmth exists only in the easy, unpressured stretches between these harder tests. Notice the deepest signs you have received across your most important relationships, the ones that arrived under real pressure rather than under comfortable, easy conditions, and let those, more than any single warm sentence, be the account you have finally learned to trust. You already knew before tonight, somewhere underneath the 100 signs this hour has named, a quieter recognition has probably been settling in, that none of this was actually new information, only a naming of things you had already, quietly, felt for years without ever finding the language to say them out loud. You knew when the smile did not reach the eyes. You knew when the reply took a beat too long, when the goodbye came a little too quickly, when a name was avoided rather than spoken. You knew all of it. Not because you had studied any of these signals deliberately, but because your body has been reading them fluently and continuously your entire life, producing a knowing that arrives as a feeling long before it ever arrives as a thought. And that turns out, more often than the careful, analytical mind wants to admit, to have been right the whole time. This knowing existed before the words tonight gave it, before the reasoning that sometimes talked you out of trusting it, before the second-guessing that arrives whenever an inconvenient truth feels too uncomfortable to simply accept. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means you were never actually as unaware as you may have feared across the years, missing every important signal, blind to what was unfolding around you. When the truer story is that you were receiving nearly all of it continuously, your body reading fluently the entire time, and simply had not yet been given full permission to trust the reading. The 100 signs across this whole video were never really lessons in the sense of new material to memorize. They were closer to labels. Names finally attached to sensations you have been carrying quietly for years without the vocabulary to explain them clearly to yourself, let alone to anyone else. Notice how much of tonight felt less like learning something entirely new, and more like finally being given permission to trust what some part of you had already known for a very long time. Your body always read the room. Long before any conscious analysis had the chance to begin, your body had already scanned a room, the faces, the postures, the general temperature of the space, and delivered its verdict as a feeling, a warmth or a chill, a sense of welcome or a sense of quiet danger. All of it arriving well before a single word had actually been exchanged with anyone present. This kind of reading is among the oldest forms of intelligence a human being carries. The exact capacity that once determined whether an ancestor correctly judged a group's disposition in time to matter. Refined across an almost unimaginable stretch of generations and still running now, in you, with the same automatic, unasked-for precision it always has. The feeling itself is not irrational. Even though it often gets dismissed as such, it is simply faster than language, older than reasoning, produced by a system that was reading social signals for longer than any spoken word has existed. This ancient reading system does not require any special training to access, only a willingness to trust the very first impression a room gives you before your more analytical mind starts constructing a more polite, more socially acceptable interpretation over the top of it. An overlay that is often, despite its confident tone, considerably less accurate than the instant, wordless verdict that arrived first. There is a specific kind of relief available in trusting the system more fully, since it means the conscious mind is spared from having to calculate its way through every new social situation entirely from scratch. Some deeper, older part of you has already been doing that work continuously, quietly, your whole life, long before you ever thought to give it any credit. Notice how much your own body has already known, walking into rooms across your entire life, before your slower, more careful mind ever finished catching up to confirm it. The gut feeling was right. A feeling arrived once about someone or something, wordless and immediate, and got overridden anyway, talked out of existence by a more comfortable, more reasonable-sounding conclusion your careful mind preferred instead. And later, sometimes much later, that overridden feeling turned out to have been correct all along. The gut feeling is not mysterious. It is the unconscious mind's extremely rapid synthesis of everything available to it, verbal and nonverbal, current and remembered, producing a verdict so fast that the conscious mind cannot fully reconstruct the reasoning behind it. And the inability to explain it is exactly what makes it so easy to distrust, since a culture trained to demand visible proof will always be suspicious of a conclusion that cannot show its work. This does not mean every gut feeling deserves blind, unquestioning obedience, since the same system can occasionally misfire, drawing on an old pattern that does not actually apply to the present situation. But it does mean the feeling deserves a genuine seat at the table rather than automatic dismissal simply because it cannot produce a tidy, footnoted explanation on demand the moment it is questioned. A feeling that keeps returning across several unrelated encounters with the same person carries more weight than one that flared once and faded, since repetition across separate occasions is what separates a genuine, accumulating perception from a single, possibly mistaken impression formed under unusual circumstances. The feelings worth trusting most are usually the quiet, persistent ones, the discomfort that keeps returning despite every reasonable argument you construct against it, rather than the loud, dramatic ones that tend to arrive from anxiety instead of genuine perception. Notice the feelings you have had about people that you could not fully explain at the time, and let the ones that turned out to be right stand as quiet, patient evidence for the ones you have not yet learned to trust. You ignored what you saw. Somewhere in your past, a sign was visible and you saw it clearly, and still you moved forward anyway. Not from blindness, but from something closer to hope. The hope that the sign was wrong feeling, in that specific moment, far more bearable than the alternative of accepting what your own perception had already delivered to you. This was never stupidity. It was protection. The mind managing a truth it could see perfectly well, but was not yet ready to fully carry, choosing the softer, more survivable story over the harder, more accurate one, because the accurate one, at that particular time, would have cost more than you had available to spend. There is no failure to locate anywhere in this story, only a psyche doing exactly what psyches are built to do, protecting itself from a truth it was not yet resourced enough to fully carry. And the fact that you are able to look back at it clearly now, rather than still needing the protection you once needed, is itself quiet evidence of how much more capacity you have built since then. The version of you who once looked away was not weaker than the version reading this now, only earlier, still gathering the resources that the present version has since finished gathering. And the gap between the two is not a verdict against the earlier one, only the ordinary shape of growth, happening exactly on its own unhurried schedule. Compassion for that earlier version of yourself, the one who chose the softer story, is not a small or sentimental thing here. It is the actual work, since blaming yourself now for a survival strategy that once served you well only repeats the same harshness the original hoping was trying to avoid in the first place. Notice the signs you once saw and quietly set aside, and let that setting aside be met with understanding rather than regret, since the seeing itself was never actually the failure, only the timing of what came after it. The knowing you were taught to doubt, a capacity for reading people accurately, was present in you long before anyone taught you anything about it. But somewhere along the way, messages arrived that undermined that natural reading. Be nice. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Do not judge. Each one quietly asking you to override your own honest perception in favor of someone else's comfort. The teaching came from good intentions in most cases, but the result was a person who learned to distrust the very instrument that had been reading the social world with real accuracy the entire time, dismissing an honest read as unkind or paranoid when it was, in fact, simply correct. Reclaiming this particular knowing does not require becoming harsh or suspicious of the people around you, only restoring an accuracy that kindness had quietly been asked to override for far longer than was ever actually fair to you. A small correction that lets you remain generous while no longer needing to be blind in order to stay that way. It helps to remember where the original teaching came from, usually a well-meaning adult managing a child's disappointment, rather than a considered argument about how perception actually works, which means the rule absorbed in childhood was never actually built for the more discerning adult, now being asked to keep obeying it. The distinction worth holding on to is simple, that accurate perception and generous judgment were never actually opposites, only a culture eager for easy harmony had trained you to believe they were. Notice how often you have doubted your own accurate reading of a person because the reading did not feel generous enough, and let that doubting begin, gently, to loosen its grip tonight. The proof was in the pattern. No single gesture, no single sentence, no single silence ever proved anything definitively on its own. Since any isolated moment can always be explained away by mood, by circumstance, by simple accident. But the pattern, the same behavior repeating across enough separate occasions, removes that easy explanation and leaves behind something closer to an actual verdict. A single smile means very little. 100 smiles, consistent across every mood and every circumstance, mean a great deal. A single absence is forgivable. 100 absences, repeated reliably, describe a choice rather than a coincidence. This is, in its own quiet way, a relief rather than a burden, since it means you never actually needed to solve every relationship from a single confusing interaction. The fuller picture was always going to arrive on its own, given enough time and enough repetition, patiently accumulating into something unmistakable long after any single confusing evening had already been forgotten. It also means an occasional bad day from someone otherwise consistent should be weighed against the whole pattern rather than treated as a sudden verdict, since one discordant note in an otherwise steady melody rarely rewrites the song, while a discordant note that keeps repeating eventually becomes the song itself. Patience is the only real requirement here, the willingness to wait for enough repetitions to accumulate before deciding anything final. Resisting the urge to reach a verdict after a single data point simply because uncertainty feels uncomfortable and a quick answer, even a wrong one, can feel easier to live with than an honest, unfinished picture still gathering its shape. Notice the patterns that have quietly been forming around you across your relationships and let the accumulated weight of repetition, rather than any single memorable moment, be the evidence you finally choose to trust. You do not need their confirmation. So much energy gets spent hoping someone will finally say the words directly, will confirm out loud what their actions have already been saying continuously for months or years, when the truth is that the confirmation you have been waiting for has, in most cases, already arrived, delivered through every channel except the one you were taught to consider the only reliable one. The seeking of verbal confirmation is often not really about needing new information at all. It is about needing permission to finally believe what the body has already been telling you. And that permission, it turns out, was never actually anyone else's to grant. This does not make the words themselves worthless. Hearing them can still feel good, but it does mean your certainty about how someone feels was never actually required to wait for their willingness to say it plainly out loud, since the evidence, gathered patiently across every channel this whole video has named, had already delivered its verdict long before any sentence arrived to confirm it. Some people simply never learned the vocabulary for saying feelings plainly, carrying real devotion inside a family or a culture that rarely modeled saying it aloud, and waiting on their words alone would mean overlooking everything their actions have already, patiently, been saying instead. The waiting itself often has an old root, a much earlier relationship where love genuinely was conditional on hearing the right words at the right moment, and the nervous system, once trained that way, keeps applying that old rule to new people who were never actually playing by it, long after the original relationship that taught the rule has ended. You are allowed to know what you know, fully, even without ever hearing it spoken back to you directly. Notice how much of your own waiting has really been a search for permission rather than for information, and let that permission, tonight, finally come from you. Trust the feeling, not the words. When a person's words say one thing and everything else about them says another, the feeling produced by that mismatch is almost always the more accurate signal, because the feeling is generated by a system processing far more information, faster and more completely, than any carefully chosen sentence was ever built to contain. The words are the version someone has decided to present. The feeling is your own comprehensive, largely unconscious assessment of everything beneath that presentation and between the two. The feeling has consistently proven itself the more trustworthy witness across nearly every relationship where the two have ever disagreed. This does not mean every disagreement between feeling and words reveals a deception. Sometimes the mismatch has a simple, harmless explanation, but the feeling deserves to be genuinely weighed, rather than automatically dismissed. The moment the more articulate, more confident-sounding words arrive to contradict it. Words are also easier to rehearse than a face or a posture, which is exactly why a mismatch tends to surface first in the parts of a person that were never built for performance. The small delay, the flicker of tension, the tone that does not quite match the sentence being spoken. Learning to notice this mismatch is less about suspicion and more about simple honesty with yourself, allowing the discomfort that follows a contradictory moment to register fully instead of being reasoned away the instant it arrives, since the reasoning away is usually faster and more practiced than the noticing, and only deliberate attention tips the balance back toward the feeling. Give the feeling the same courtesy you would give a witness, allowed to speak fully before any verdict gets decided. Notice the moments this week when a feeling and a set of words point in different directions, and let the feeling, quietly and without needing to justify itself, carry the greater share of your trust. The people who mean it show it. The people who genuinely value you rarely require careful interpretation to be understood, since their regard tends to show up plainly in the way they lean toward you, the way their face lifts when you arrive, the effort that appears without being requested, the space made, the future that naturally includes you, the crisis that draws them closer instead of further away. This showing is not usually dramatic. It is steady, small, and repeated. The quiet, reliable evidence of a regard that does not need to be decoded because it was never encoded in the first place, offered plainly by people who never learned, or never needed to learn, how to hide what they actually felt. There is a particular comfort in recognizing this fully, since it means the exhausting work of decoding, analyzing, and second-guessing was never actually meant to apply to your closest, safest relationships in the first place. That heavier work belongs to the more ambiguous connections, while the people who genuinely mean it have been making themselves easy to understand the entire time. If a relationship has quietly required constant interpretation for years, endless analysis of what a gesture really meant, that ongoing difficulty is itself a kind of answer. Since ease of reading is not a small detail among many, but one of the clearest signs of genuine, uncomplicated regard available anywhere on this list. It is worth measuring the effort honestly here too, comparing how much energy gets spent decoding one particular relationship against how little gets spent decoding another, since a wide gap between the two is rarely an accident of personality and usually a fairly accurate map of where the simplest, least complicated regard actually lives. Notice the people in your life whose care has always been simple to read, and let that simplicity itself be recognized as one of the clearest proofs available, tonight and every night after this one. The quiet knowing that settles now. Everything this long night has offered arrives now, not as new information demanding further analysis, but as a kind of settling. 100 small confirmations finding their place in a mind that has, for once, stopped arguing with what it has always quietly known. There is nothing left to solve here tonight, nothing left to prove, only the simple, gentle fact of a knowing that has finally been given permission to settle exactly where it always belonged. Every sign named tonight, the smile, the pause, the pattern, the absence, has already done its work, quietly, without needing anything further from you. The body that read every room, the gut that felt every mismatch, the memory that carried every small, unrepeated detail, can finally stop working now. Its long shift over, its accumulated evidence no longer needing to be reviewed or double-checked before it can be trusted completely. Let it settle now, slowly, the way everything eventually settles once it has finally been seen clearly and does not need to be seen again tonight. Let the questioning finally grow quiet, here, in the dark, with nothing left to figure out before sleep is allowed to come, nothing left to prove to anyone, least of all to yourself. The signs that rest beside you. Everything. This whole night named, the smile, the pause, the pupil, the silence, the absence, the pattern, is resting quietly beside you now, no longer requiring your attention, no longer waiting to be decoded, simply present, the way understanding settles once it has finally arrived and has nothing left to prove. None of it needs holding on to any longer, not one single sign. It has already, quietly, become part of you. The way everything you truly learn eventually stops feeling like knowledge and simply becomes who you are. There is no test waiting in the morning, no further sign to catch, no further pattern to track. Only the quiet certainty that whatever you needed to notice across this long night has already been noticed, fully, and does not need noticing again. Nothing further is required of you tonight. Only this stillness, only this settling, only the quiet, unremarkable act of finally allowing all 100 signs to simply exist, undisturbed, exactly where they have already settled. The truth that lets you sleep. The truth is simple. The people who love you have been showing you the whole time. The people who do not have been showing you too. And somewhere inside you, quietly, without needing a single word, you have always known which was which. That knowing is yours now, fully, gently, held safe in the dark, resting beside you the way it has rested beside you every night before this one. There is nothing left to read tonight, nothing left to analyze, only the quiet, settled truth that you have always known more than you ever let yourself believe. Every face, every pause, every pattern this night traced has already found its place, and none of it is going anywhere before morning. None of it needs revisiting, before your eyes are allowed to close. Sleep now. The knowing is safe. The signs are settled, quietly, beside you. And you, who have always seen more than you gave yourself credit for, who have been reading people fluently your entire life, without ever once needing to be taught, can finally, gently, close your eyes.